Close your eyes, breathe slowly. Tonight we travel to the oldest civilization the world has ever known, to a land of golden sand and black river mud, of god-kings and towering stone, of a people who looked at death and refused to accept it, who built their entire civilization around the conviction that the soul does not end when the body does. We travel to the banks of the Nile, where 30 dynasties of pharaohs ruled for 3,000 years, where the pyramids still stand as they have stood since before the birth of every other wonder of the ancient world, where the gods walked among the living in the form of animal and man, and the eternal river gave life to everything it touched. Let the darkness carry you. We begin. Fact 1. The gift of the Nile, how a river made a civilization. Ancient Egypt was, in the most literal and most profound sense, the creation of a single river. The Nile, the longest river on Earth, flowing northward for more than 6,000 kilometers from its sources in the mountains of Central Africa to its delta on the Mediterranean coast, transformed what would otherwise have been an uninhabitable extension of the Sahara Desert into the most agriculturally productive and the most durably stable civilization in the history of the ancient world. Its annual flood depositing on the narrow strip of cultivable land along its banks the rich dark silt that the Egyptians called Kemet, the Black Land, which gave the soil a fertility so extraordinary that a single harvest could sustain a population, whose labor was then free to build the monuments, maintain the temples, and support the bureaucratic and religious apparatus of a state whose continuity, across more than 3,000 years, has no parallel in the history of human civilization. The annual inundation of the Nile, which the Egyptians called Akhit, the first of the 3 seasons into which they divided their year, followed by Peret, the growing season, and Shemu, the harvest, was not merely an agricultural event but a theological one, understood as the gift of the god Hapi, the personification of the flood, whose abundance was the visible expression of the divine generosity that sustained all life. The Egyptians divided their world along the axis of the river into 2 complementary halves, Kemet, the black land of the fertile flood plain, and Deseret, the red land of the desert beyond it. Understanding this division not merely as a geographic fact, but as a moral and cosmological one, the boundary between life and death, between order and chaos, between the world that the gods maintained and the void that surrounded it. Without the Nile there is no Egypt, not the pyramids, not the pharaohs, not the gods, not the 3,000 years of continuous civilization whose achievements still astonish the world. The river did not merely support the civilization. It was the civilization, flowing through it like blood through a body, giving it life with every annual return. Fact 2. The unification of Egypt, the first nation on Earth. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under a single ruler in approximately 3100 BCE, the event that Egyptologists regard as the founding moment of the Egyptian state, and that the ancient Egyptians themselves commemorated in the iconography of the double crown, the Peshent, whose combination of the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt symbolized the union of the 2 lands in the person of the pharaoh, is the earliest documented example in human history of the formation of a large-scale territorial state, a political achievement whose significance extends far beyond the borders of the Nile Valley to encompass the entire question of how human beings first organized themselves into the complex, hierarchical, literate societies that we call civilizations. The figure traditionally credited with this unification is the pharaoh Nama, identified by most Egyptologists with the legendary King Menes, who appears in the later ancient Egyptian king lists as the founder of the first dynasty, whose commemoration on the Nama palette, a ceremonial carved slate palette discovered at Hierakonpolis in 1898 and now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, shows the king wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt on one side and the red crown of Lower Egypt on the other, smiting his enemies and inspecting the decapitated bodies of the defeated in a visual vocabulary of royal power and cosmic order that would define Egyptian royal iconography for the next 3,000 years without fundamental change. The particular achievement of the Egyptian state in these earliest centuries was not merely the military unification of the 2 lands, but the creation of the administrative, religious, and ideological apparatus that held the unified state together. The development of hieroglyphic writing, whose earliest examples date to the decades immediately preceding and following the unification. The establishment of the bureaucratic system of record-keeping and tax collection, whose efficiency sustained the state through the long centuries of dynastic rule. And the elaboration of the royal ideology, whose identification of the pharaoh with the god Horus, the divine falcon, made the political order a reflection of the cosmic order in a way that gave to the state the religious legitimacy, without which no ancient political system could long survive. Fact 3. The pharaoh, living god on earth. The pharaoh, the institution of divine kingship around which the entire political, religious, and social structure of ancient Egyptian civilization was organized, was not, in the Egyptian understanding, merely a king in the ordinary sense of a powerful human ruler whose authority derives from military force, dynastic inheritance, or popular consent, but a being of a fundamentally different order. The living embodiment of the god Horus on earth, the mediating figure between the human and the divine whose ritual performance of the ceremonies and obligations of kingship maintained the cosmic order, the Egyptian concept of Ma'at, the right relationship between all things, without which the universe would collapse back into the primordial chaos from which the gods had drawn it at the moment of creation. The word pharaoh itself derives from the Egyptian parah, meaning great house, originally a reference to the royal palace rather than to its occupant, which came into use as a title for the king only during the New Kingdom period of approximately 1550 to 1070 BCE, though it is the term by which modern usage designates the rulers of all periods. The pharaoh was understood to be simultaneously human and divine, born of the union between the reigning king and the god Ammon, who was said to have taken the form of the human father for the purpose of the conception, and his death was understood not as an ending but as a transformation. The pharaoh became Osiris, the god of the dead, while his successor became Horus, and the cycle of divine kingship continued unbroken. The practical consequences of this theology for the organization of Egyptian society were total. The pharaoh owned all the land of Egypt, directed all major construction projects, commanded the army, presided over the legal system, and served as the chief priest of every god in the Egyptian pantheon, delegating these functions to officials and priests but retaining the ultimate authority in each domain, an authority whose divine foundation made it not merely politically but cosmologically absolute. Fact 4. Hieroglyphics, the writing that speaks in pictures. The hieroglyphic writing system of ancient Egypt, whose name derives from the Greek words for sacred and carved, reflecting the system's use in the monumental inscriptions of temples and tombs, whose particular combination of beauty and durability made it the most visually spectacular writing system in the history of human civilization, was developed in the centuries immediately surrounding the unification of Egypt in approximately 3100 BCE, making it one of the 2 or 3 earliest writing systems in the world, and the one whose continuous use, across more than 3,500 years from its earliest known examples to its last known inscription, carved in 394 CE on the Temple of Philae, represents the longest unbroken tradition of a single writing system in the history of literacy. The hieroglyphic system combined 3 types of signs in a way that gave it an extraordinary expressive flexibility. Logograms, signs that represent the objects they depict. Phonograms, signs that represent sounds rather than objects, whose particular use allowed the system to write words for which no pictorial representation was practical. And determinatives, unpronounced signs placed at the end of words to indicate the category of meaning to which they belong, helping the reader distinguish between words that would otherwise be written identically. The key to the modern understanding of hieroglyphics was the Rosetta Stone, discovered by French soldiers in 1799 during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign at the town of Rashid in the Nile Delta, the stone bearing the same text in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic, the demotic script that had replaced hieroglyphics in everyday use, and Greek. The French scholar Jean-François Champollion, building on the work of the English polymath Thomas Young, achieved the decisive breakthrough in decipherment in 1822, recognizing that the hieroglyphic script was not purely symbolic, as had long been assumed, but phonetic, and opening, in a single stroke of intellectual clarity, the entire archive of ancient Egyptian civilization to the reading of the modern world. Fact 5. The Old Kingdom, the Age of the Pyramids. The Old Kingdom of ancient Egypt, the period spanning approximately 2686 to 2181 BCE, encompassing the 3rd through 6th dynasties, and representing the first great flowering of Egyptian civilization in its most characteristic and most enduring forms, was the age in which the Egyptian state achieved the organizational capacity, the theological confidence, and the sheer concentrated human energy required to produce the most astonishing building program in the history of the ancient world. The construction of the pyramid complexes of Giza, Saqqara, Darsha, and Abusia, whose scale, precision, and durability have made them the most immediately recognizable human-made structures on the surface of the earth for the past 4,000 years, and the only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world still standing. The first true pyramid was the step pyramid of Djoser, constructed at Saqqara under the direction of the architect Imhotep, the first named architect in history, during the reign of the 3rd dynasty pharaoh Djoser in approximately 2650 BCE. Its 6-step tiers rising to a height of 62 meters above the desert plateau in a form that represented, in architectural terms, a staircase by which the dead king could ascend to the heavens to join the circumpolar stars. The subsequent development from the stepped form to the smooth-sided true pyramid, through the experimental bent pyramid and red pyramid of Snefru at Darsha, culminated in the reign of Snefru's son Khufu, who commissioned the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza. The largest stone structure ever built by human beings, containing an estimated 2.3 million stone blocks with an average weight of 2.5 to 15 tons each, rising to an original height of 146.5 meters, and built to tolerances of accuracy, the base level to within 2.1 centimeters, the sides oriented to the cardinal directions to within a fraction of a degree, that remain extraordinary by the standards of any era of construction. Fact 6. The Great Pyramid, the wonder that outlasted the world. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built as the tomb of the 4th dynasty pharaoh Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, during the approximate period of 2560 to 2540 BCE on a plateau on the west bank of the Nile near the modern city of Cairo, stood as the tallest structure on Earth for approximately 3,800 years, from its completion until the construction of the Lincoln Cathedral in England in 1311 CE. A record of architectural supremacy that no other human construction has approached, and that invites a kind of temporal vertigo when its full dimensions are grasped. The pyramid was already older, at the time of its visit by the Greek historian Herodotus in the 5th century BCE, than Herodotus is to us. The construction of the Great Pyramid required an estimated 20,000 workers, not, as the popular imagination long assumed, enslaved people driven by the whip, but a permanent and rotating workforce of skilled craftsmen, engineers and laborers who were housed in purpose-built workers' villages near the construction site, fed a diet of bread, beer, beef and fish whose nutritional adequacy has been confirmed by the analysis of the animal bones found in the workers' settlement. And buried with care when they died on the project, their tombs found and excavated near the pyramid complex. The interior of the Great Pyramid contains 3 chambers connected by passages of extraordinary engineering precision. The subterranean chamber cut into the bedrock below the pyramid, the so-called Queen's Chamber in the body of the pyramid, and the King's Chamber, the burial chamber proper, in the heart of the structure. Its walls lined with the red granite, brought 600 kilometers from the quarries at Aswan, and its ceiling constructed from 9 massive granite slabs, whose combined weight of approximately 400 tons, is distributed by a series of relieving chambers above them, whose particular engineering solution to the problem of roof load remains one of the most elegant structural achievements of the ancient world. Fact 7. The Sphinx, the guardian of the plateau. The Great Sphinx of Giza, the massive limestone sculpture of a recumbent lion with a human head that crouches at the eastern end of the Giza plateau, facing the rising sun with an expression whose particular combination of serenity and authority has made it the most immediately recognizable sculpture in the history of the ancient world, is the largest monolithic statue on Earth. Carved directly from the natural bedrock of the plateau to a length of approximately 73 meters and a height of 20 meters, and is understood by most Egyptologists to have been commissioned by the 4th dynasty pharaoh Khufu in approximately 2530 BCE, during the same general period as the construction of Khufu's own pyramid, the second of the 3 great pyramids of Giza, whose causeway aligns with the Sphinx in a way that suggests the 2 structures were conceived as part of a single architectural and theological program. The face of the Sphinx, whose original paint, traces of which remain in protected areas, was red with a blue and yellow striped Nemes headdress, is understood to represent the pharaoh Khufu himself, or possibly his father Khufu. Combining in a single image the human intelligence of the king and the leonine power of the sun god to create a guardian figure whose particular theological significance was the protection of the royal necropolis and the facilitation of the dead king's transformation into the solar deity with whom the Sphinx is associated. The Sphinx has spent most of its history buried to the neck in the desert sand that accumulated around it. The first recorded excavation was ordered by the pharaoh Thutmose IV of the 18th dynasty, who commemorated the event on the dream stele placed between the Sphinx's paws, on which he recorded that the Sphinx appeared to him in a dream and promised him the throne of Egypt in exchange for clearing the sand from its body. The story is the oldest recorded dream in history, and the Sphinx is still there, watching the horizon as it has watched for 4,500 years. Fact 8. The Egyptian gods, a world alive with the divine. The religious world of ancient Egypt was populated by a pantheon of gods whose number, by the height of the New Kingdom period, numbered in the hundreds, each of them the personification of a natural force, a cosmic principle, or a dimension of the royal or afterlife theology, each associated with a specific animal or animal-headed human form whose particular symbolism encoded a precise theological meaning. And each worshipped in the network of temples, whose construction and maintenance constituted the primary economic activity of the Egyptian state across the entire span of its civilization. The most theologically central of the Egyptian gods were Ra, the sun god, whose daily journey across the sky in his solar bark and his nightly passage through the underworld to be reborn at dawn constituted the primary cosmological narrative of Egyptian religion, and whose fusion with the Theban god Amun as Amun-Ra created the supreme deity of the New Kingdom whose priests accumulated by the end of the New Kingdom period. A proportion of the land and wealth of Egypt that rivaled that of the pharaoh himself. Osiris, the god of the dead and the ruler of the underworld, whose mythology of murder, dismemberment and resurrection by his wife Isis created the theological template for the Egyptian understanding of death and afterlife. Isis, the great mother goddess whose magical power, cunning and devotion to her husband and son made her the most beloved of the Egyptian goddesses, and whose cult survived the end of Egyptian civilization itself, spreading across the Roman world in the centuries before Christianity and persisting until the 5th century CE. Horus, the falcon-headed sky god and son of Osiris and Isis, whose identification with the living pharaoh made him the central figure of royal theology, and Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming and the guardian of the dead, whose presence at the moment of death and the weighing of the soul made him one of the most immediately recognizable figures in the entire Egyptian religious imagination. Fact 9. The afterlife, Egypt's greatest obsession. No civilization in the history of humanity has invested more intellectual energy, more material resource, or more sustained institutional commitment in the preparation for death and the navigation of what follows it than ancient Egypt. A civilization whose most enduring physical legacy, the pyramids and the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, are not monuments to the living but the infrastructure of the dead, whose elaborately painted walls, whose carefully stocked chambers of food and furniture and magical texts, and whose mummified bodies preserved against the decay that would sever the soul from the physical anchor it requires for its continued existence in the afterlife, represent a collective theological project of extraordinary ambition, the conquest of death not through its denial but through its management. The Egyptian understanding of the human person was considerably more complex than the simple body-soul dualism of later Western tradition. The individual was understood to possess multiple spiritual components, including the ka, the vital life force or double that was born with the person, and that required the continued existence of the physical body or its representation in statue form in order to persist after death. The ba, often depicted as a bird with a human head, the individual personality that was free to travel between the tomb and the world of the living during the day. And the ak, the transfigured spirit, the fully realized spiritual form of the deceased, who had successfully navigated the dangers of the underworld and achieved eternal life in the presence of the gods. The process of achieving this afterlife required the correct performance of the funerary rituals, above all the mummification that preserved the body as the physical anchor for the ka, the spells and prayers of the funerary texts, whose correct recitation guided the deceased through the perils of the underworld, and the final judgment in the Hall of Two Truths, where the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Maat, and where a favorable verdict opened the door to eternal life in the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, conceived as an idealized version of the Nile Valley itself, where the blessed dead lived in abundance, and the grain grew taller than any field the living had ever seen. Fact 10. Ancient Egypt at 10. 10 facts into the history of ancient Egypt, and already the civilization has revealed something of its extraordinary character, its scale, its continuity, its obsessions, and the particular genius with which it organized an entire society around a set of convictions about the nature of reality that no subsequent civilization has shared in quite the same form. We have stood on the banks of the Nile and understood that without the river there is nothing, no black soil, no surplus grain, no released labor, no pyramids, no pharaohs, no 3,000 years of continuous civilization. We have watched the two lands become one and recognized in that unification not merely a political event, but the birth of something that had never existed before, a territorial state of sufficient size and complexity to be called, without anachronism, a nation. We have stood before the pharaoh and grasped the audacity of the theological claim that the man in the double crown is not merely a king, but a god, that the political order is the cosmic order made visible, that the correct performance of the royal rituals is the condition of the universe's continued existence. We have read the hieroglyphs on the wall of the tomb, climbed the interior passages of the Great Pyramid in our imagination, and looked into the stone eyes of the Sphinx as it watches the horizon it has watched for 4,500 years. We have met the gods, Ra and Osiris and Isis and Horus and Anubis, and understood that their world was not a fairy tale, but a serious attempt to map the invisible forces that govern the visible world. And we have stood at the entrance to the Egyptian afterlife and recognized the question it asks: what do you do with the knowledge that you will die? 90 facts remain. The story is only beginning. Rest now in the dark. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 11. Mummification, the art of eternal preservation. Mummification, the elaborate process by which the ancient Egyptians preserved the bodies of their dead against the decay that would sever the soul from the physical anchor it required for its continued existence in the afterlife, was not a single fixed procedure, but a practice that evolved over more than 2,000 years of refinement, reaching its most technically sophisticated form during the New Kingdom period and representing, in its fully developed state, one of the most remarkable achievements of ancient medical and chemical knowledge in the entire history of the ancient world. The process, as described by the Greek historian Herodotus, and confirmed in its broad outlines by modern analysis of surviving mummies, took 70 days to complete, a duration that matched the period during which the star Sirius, associated with the goddess Isis, disappeared below the horizon before its annual heliacal rising, a celestial correspondence that gave the process its sacred temporal framework. The embalmers, specialists whose hereditary craft was conducted in designated workshops near the necropolis, began by removing the internal organs through an incision in the left side of the abdomen, placing the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines in the 4 canopic jars whose stoppers bore the heads of the 4 sons of Horus, each responsible for the protection of a particular organ. The brain was extracted through the nostril using a metal hook, liquefied and discarded, the Egyptians understanding the heart, not the brain, as the seat of consciousness and identity, and accordingly leaving the heart in place within the body for the final judgment. The body cavity was then packed and covered with natron, a naturally occurring salt whose desiccating properties drew the remaining moisture from the tissues over a period of 40 days, after which the dried body was wrapped in hundreds of meters of linen bandages, between whose layers the embalmers placed protective amulets, whose particular forms and whose particular placement on the body were prescribed by the funerary texts. Each amulet guarding a different part of the deceased against the specific dangers they would face in the underworld. The resulting mummy, placed in its nested coffins, surrounded by its grave goods, and sealed in its tomb, was the physical foundation on which the entire Egyptian vision of the afterlife rested. Fact 12. The Valley of the Kings, Egypt's hidden necropolis. The Valley of the Kings, the remote desert valley on the west bank of the Nile, opposite the ancient city of Thebes, now the modern city of Luxor, in which the pharaohs of the New Kingdom period chose to conceal their tombs in the hope that anonymity in death would succeed where the pyramids' visibility had failed, sparing their mummified bodies and their treasure-filled burial chambers from the robbers who had already emptied every pyramid tomb in Egypt by the time of the Middle Kingdom. Contains 63 known tombs cut into the limestone cliffs of the valley, each one a corridor of painted chambers descending into the rock, whose walls are covered from floor to ceiling with the religious texts and divine images that were understood to equip the dead king for the journey through the underworld and the transformation into the solar deity that was the goal of the royal afterlife. The decision to abandon the pyramid as the royal burial monument and substitute for it, the hidden rock-cut tomb, was made at the beginning of the 18th dynasty in approximately 1550 BCE, a decision whose practical logic, the protection of the royal burial from robbers, was ultimately unsuccessful, since virtually every tomb in the Valley of the Kings was robbed in antiquity, most of them within a few centuries of the burial, by the workers who had cut the tombs and who knew their layout better than anyone alive. The one spectacular exception, the tomb of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun, whose relatively modest burial in a small tomb cut into the valley floor was overlooked by the ancient robbers and remained largely intact until its discovery by the British archaeologist Howard Carter on November 4, 1922, revealed, in the 5,000 objects packed into its 4 small chambers, a glimpse of the extraordinary wealth with which the New Kingdom pharaohs were buried. A glimpse whose impact on the modern imagination was so immediate and so lasting that Tutankhamun, a minor pharaoh who died at approximately 19 years of age after a reign of less than a decade, and who left no significant military or architectural legacy, became the most famous individual in the entire history of ancient Egypt. Fact 13. Tutankhamun, the boy king and his golden tomb. Tutankhamun, born in approximately 1341 BCE, almost certainly the son of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten and his secondary wife, ascending to the throne at approximately 9 years of age, following the death of his father and the brief reigns of two successors, and dying at approximately 19 in circumstances that modern forensic analysis of his mummy has variously attributed to malaria, a broken leg, the genetic complications of royal inbreeding, or some combination of all three, would be entirely unknown to the modern world were it not for the accident of his tomb's survival. Yet his name has become, in the century since Howard Carter's discovery, synonymous with the entire civilization of ancient Egypt in the popular imagination. His golden funerary mask, the serene, idealized face of a young king in blue and gold striped Nemes headdress, with eyes outlined in lapis lazuli and a false beard of plaited gold. Perhaps the single most reproduced image from the ancient world. The contents of the tomb were a revelation not merely of wealth, but of the texture of ancient Egyptian life. The gilded shrines nested one within another around the quartzite sarcophagus, the three coffins of which the innermost was made of solid gold weighing more than 100 kilograms, the throne with its extraordinary inlaid scene of the king and queen in an intimate domestic moment, the chariots dismantled and stored in the antechamber, the ivory and ebony game boards, the linen garments, the food offerings in their sealed jars, the folded child's chair that may have been used by the king in his infancy. All of them accumulated over the frantic 70 days between the king's death and the sealing of the tomb, many of them hastily repainted or relabeled from the funerary equipment prepared for predecessors, suggesting that Tutankhamun's death was unexpected and his burial conducted in a hurry by officials who were not entirely prepared. The curse of Tutankhamun, the supposed supernatural deaths of those who violated the tomb, is one of the most persistent myths in popular Egyptology, and one of the least supported by the actual mortality statistics of those who were present at the excavation, most of whom lived to unremarkable old ages. Fact 14. Ramesses the Great, Egypt's most celebrated pharaoh. Ramesses II, known to posterity as Ramesses the Great, the third pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, who ruled Egypt for approximately 66 years, from 1279 to 1213 BCE, outliving most of his sons and surviving into his 90s in an era when the average life expectancy was a fraction of that, was the most prolific builder, the most aggressive self-promoter, and arguably the most militarily active pharaoh in the entire history of ancient Egypt. A figure whose particular combination of genuine achievement and extraordinary talent for self-aggrandizement has made him the dominant figure in the popular understanding of Egyptian civilization, and the pharaoh most frequently proposed by scholars as the historical model for the unnamed ruler of the Book of Exodus, though the historical evidence for any specific connection between Ramesses and the biblical narrative remains disputed. The military career of Ramesses was defined by the Battle of Kadesh in approximately 1274 BCE, fought against the Hittite Empire of Muwatalli II in what is now southern Syria. It was the largest chariot battle in ancient history, involving an estimated 5,000 chariots on both sides, and it ended in a tactical stalemate that Ramesses immediately and systematically transformed, through the most comprehensive royal propaganda campaign in the ancient world, into a magnificent personal victory, commissioning accounts of the battle that covered the walls of every major temple he built across Egypt and Nubia, and portraying himself single-handedly routing the Hittite army through the direct intervention of the god Amun. The peace treaty that ended the long conflict with the Hittites, concluded in 1259 BCE and preserved in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform, making it the oldest known international peace treaty in history, is a document of considerable diplomatic sophistication, whose copy hangs today in the United Nations headquarters in New York as a symbol of the antiquity of the human aspiration toward peaceful resolution of conflict. Fact 15. The temples of Abu Simbel, carved into the mountain. The twin temples of Abu Simbel, carved directly into the sandstone cliffs of the west bank of the Nile, at the Second Cataract in what is now the extreme south of Egypt near the border with Sudan, commissioned by Ramesses II in approximately 1264 BCE, and dedicated to the gods Ra-Horakhti, Amun, and Ptah, as well as to the deified person of Ramesses himself, completed over a period of approximately 20 years. And oriented with an astronomical precision that caused the rising sun to penetrate the innermost sanctuary and illuminate the seated figures of the gods on 2 days each year, February 22 and October 22, dates that correspond to the anniversary of Ramesses' accession and his birthday respectively, are among the most dramatic architectural achievements of the ancient world and a monument whose modern history is in some respects as extraordinary as its ancient one. The Great Temple is fronted by 4 colossal seated figures of Ramesses himself, each approximately 20 meters in height, carved from the living rock of the cliff face, and representing the pharaoh in the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, their scale intended to awe into submission the Nubian peoples to the south, and to announce at the empire's southern boundary the absolute power of the Egyptian state and its divine king. The small temple nearby was dedicated to the goddess Hathor and to Ramesses' chief wife Nefertari, whose honor in being commemorated in her own temple was unprecedented in Egyptian royal tradition. The 6 colossal figures flanking the entrance alternating between images of Ramesses and images of Nefertari in a visual equality that no queen before her had received. The modern history of Abu Simbel involves one of the most extraordinary feats of archaeological preservation ever undertaken. Between 1964 and 1968, in response to the rising waters of Lake Nasser created by the construction of the Aswan High Dam, an international team of engineers cut the entire complex into more than 2,000 blocks, each weighing up to 30 tons, and reassembled them on an artificial hill 65 meters above and 200 meters back from their original position, preserving the temples that would otherwise have been permanently submerged. Fact 16. Hatshepsut, the woman who became pharaoh. Hatshepsut, the daughter of the 18th dynasty Pharaoh Thutmose I, wife and half-sister of Thutmose II, regent for her stepson Thutmose III following Thutmose II's death in approximately 1479 BCE, and the woman who, within the first few years of that regency, assumed the full titles and regalia of the pharaoh, had herself depicted in the masculine form. Wearing the false beard and the kilt, and the double crown of the pharaoh rather than the dress and the wig and the uraeus of the queen, and ruled Egypt as its senior king for approximately 22 years, one of the longest and most prosperous reigns in the history of the 18th dynasty, is the most remarkable individual in the history of ancient Egyptian kingship, and one of the most remarkable individuals in the history of the ancient world. Her reign was distinguished by its extraordinary commercial and architectural achievements. The trading expedition she dispatched to the land of Punt, the mysterious and wealthy territory to the south, probably in the region of modern Eritrea or Somalia, returned with shiploads of myrrh trees, ebony, ivory, gold, and exotic animals, whose unloading at the Nile docks was commemorated in extraordinary detail in the painted reliefs of her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, a building whose 3-tiered colonnaded form, set against the dramatic natural amphitheater of the Theban cliffs, is the most architecturally sophisticated structure of the New Kingdom and one of the most beautiful buildings to survive from the ancient world. Hatshepsut was for a long time invisible in the historical record, not because she had been forgotten in antiquity, but because her stepson Thutmose III, in the final decade of his reign, ordered the systematic removal of her image and her name from the monuments and inscriptions of Egypt, her figure chiseled from the walls and her cartouches overwritten with those of her male predecessors, an act whose motive remains debated: political necessity, religious propriety, personal animosity, and whose effect was that she was unknown to modern scholarship until the late 19th century, when the patient reconstruction of her erased inscriptions revealed, behind the deliberate silence, the reign of one of the most accomplished rulers in Egyptian history. Fact 17. Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh. Akhenaten, born Amenhotep IV, the 10th pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, who ascended to the throne in approximately 1353 BCE, and within the first years of his reign, initiated the most radical religious revolution in the history of ancient Egypt, abolishing the traditional polytheistic religion, closing the temples, dismissing the priests, and replacing the entire Egyptian pantheon with the sole worship of the Aten, the solar disk. Is the most controversial and the most endlessly fascinating figure in the entire history of Egyptian civilization, a pharaoh whose revolution was so total, so abrupt, and so personally identified with his own theological vision that its reversal was complete within a generation of his death, his name erased from the monuments and his city abandoned to the desert. Yet whose particular combination of religious audacity and artistic innovation left traces in the subsequent development of Egyptian culture, in the possible influence on the development of Israelite monotheism, and in the modern imagination that no subsequent attempt to unmake him has entirely succeeded in erasing. The revolution that Akhenaten imposed on Egypt was not merely theological but aesthetic and social. He built a new capital city, Akhetaten, meaning horizon of the Aten, on a virgin site in Middle Egypt that is today called Amarna, on ground that had never been consecrated to any previous god, whose construction was completed with astonishing speed through the labor of tens of thousands of workers, and which was abandoned within a decade of his death. The art of the Amarna period, the distinctive style that emerged under Akhenaten's personal direction, characterized by the elongated skulls and the pendulous bellies and the exaggerated lips, and the extraordinary naturalism of the family scenes in which Akhenaten and his beautiful wife Nefertiti play with their daughters beneath the rays of the Aten, each ray ending in a small human hand offering the ankh of life. broke with the formal conventions of Egyptian royal representation so completely and so suddenly that it remains the most startling stylistic revolution in the entire 3,000-year history of Egyptian art. Fact 18. Nefertiti, the most beautiful face of the ancient world. Nefertiti, the chief wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten, whose name means the beautiful one has come, and whose painted limestone bust, created by the sculptor Thutmose in approximately 1345 BCE, discovered by a German archaeological team in Thutmose's workshop at Amarna in 1912, and now in the News Museum in Berlin, is the most reproduced work of art from the ancient world, and the image, against which the concept of ancient Egyptian beauty is most instinctively measured, is simultaneously the most visually familiar and the most historically elusive figure in ancient Egyptian history, a queen whose extraordinary prominence during the Amarna period, where she appears in the official art not merely beside her husband, but in poses and actions traditionally reserved for the pharaoh himself, suggests a degree of political and religious authority without precedent in Egyptian royal history, and whose disappearance from the official record in approximately the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign has generated a century of scholarly debate about whether she died, fell from favor, or in the most dramatically appealing hypothesis, assumed the male identity of the pharaoh Nefertiti, ruling Egypt in her own right for a period after Akhenaten's death. The bust of Nefertiti, whose left eye socket is empty, the inlaid eye never having been inserted or subsequently lost, a detail that gives the face an uncanny asymmetry that paradoxically enhances rather than diminishes its extraordinary quality, was taken to Germany by the leader of the excavation under circumstances whose legality was contested by the Egyptian authorities at the time, and whose rectification through the bust's return to Egypt has been the subject of ongoing diplomatic negotiation for more than a century. Nefertiti remains in Berlin, her elegant neck still bearing the weight of the tall flat-topped crown that is her most distinctive attribute, her painted lips still carrying the faint suggestion of a smile that has been studied, reproduced, and wondered at by more human beings than any other face from the ancient world. Fact 19. The Book of the Dead, Egypt's Guide to the Afterlife. The Book of the Dead, known to the ancient Egyptians themselves as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, a collection of religious texts, spells, prayers, and illustrated vignettes whose purpose was to equip the deceased with the knowledge and the magical power required to navigate the dangers of the underworld, pass the final judgment before Osiris, and achieve the eternal life in the field of reeds that was the goal of every Egyptian's religious aspiration, is the most widely known and the most extensively studied of the ancient Egyptian funerary texts. Its approximately 190 individual spells or chapters drawn from the older coffin texts, and ultimately from the even older pyramid texts, the earliest known religious texts in the world, whose versions inscribed on the walls of the pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasty pharaohs at Saqqara constitute the beginning of the written religious tradition in the history of humanity. The Book of the Dead was not a fixed canonical text. Unlike the Bible or the Quran, it had no single authoritative version, but existed in a fluid tradition of compiled manuscripts whose individual copies were commissioned by wealthy individuals and customized within limits to include the spells most relevant to the particular deceased, written in hieroglyphics or the cursive hieratic script on papyrus scrolls whose length varied from a few meters to the Great Harris Papyrus, the longest surviving Egyptian papyrus at 40 meters, and placed in the coffin or tomb to accompany the dead on their journey. The most celebrated episode of the Book of the Dead is the weighing of the heart, the final judgment in which the heart of the deceased, understood as the seat of consciousness and the record of the individual's moral life, was placed on one pan of a great scale and balanced against the feather of Mat on the other, in the presence of 42 divine judges, each responsible for a specific category of sin, and in which the god Thoth recorded the outcome while the composite monster Ammit, part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile, waited beside the scale to devour the heart of the unworthy, condemning them to the second death from which there was no return. Fact 20. Ancient Egypt at 20. 20 facts into the history of ancient Egypt, and the civilization has grown around us in its full extraordinary complexity, its theology and its art, its obsession with the preservation of the body and the navigation of the afterlife, its god-kings and its queens, its heretics and its warriors, and the river that gave all of it life. We have watched the embalmers at their 70 days of work, and understood that the mummification was not superstition, but the most serious practical response imaginable to the most serious question that conscious beings face. What do we do with the fact that we die? We have descended into the Valley of the Kings and stood in the small crowded chambers of Tutankhamun's tomb, surrounded by 5,000 years of stillness, understanding that the boy king's fame is an accident of survival, that behind every excavated tomb lies the ghost of the hundreds that were emptied long ago. We have stood before the four colossi of Abu Simbel and felt the particular quality of a civilization that could carve a mountain into a face. We have met Hatshepsut, erased and restored, invisible for 3,000 years and then recovered, and recognized in her story the story of every person whose existence the powerful have tried to unmake. We have followed Akhenaten into his desert city and watched him attempt the impossible, to erase the gods of an entire civilization and replace them with a single light. And we have stood in the hall of two truths, our heart in the pan of the scale, and understood that the Egyptians believed, with total seriousness, that the universe was paying attention to how they lived. 80 facts remain, the story deepens, rest now in the dark, this is explored during sleeping. Fact 21, Egyptian medicine, healers of the ancient world. The medical tradition of ancient Egypt was the most sophisticated in the ancient world for the better part of 2,000 years. A tradition whose surviving texts reveal a system of healing that combined the empirical observation of symptoms and the practical application of treatments with the ritual and magical framework that the Egyptian understanding of illness required. Because in the Egyptian worldview, disease was rarely a purely physical phenomenon, but the consequence of the intrusion of hostile spiritual forces into the body, forces that required both the physical intervention of the healer and the magical protection of the gods to be effectively expelled. The principal surviving sources for Egyptian medicine are a small number of papyrus texts discovered in the 19th and 20th centuries, of which the most important are the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a surgical text dating in its surviving copy to approximately 1600 BCE, but almost certainly based on much older originals, whose 48 case studies of traumatic injuries, described with clinical precision and organized by anatomical region from the head downward, represent the oldest known systematic medical text in the world, and the Ebers Papyrus, a comprehensive medical compendium of approximately the same date, containing more than 700 remedies and treatments for conditions ranging from crocodile bites to dental pain to gynecological disorders. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is particularly remarkable for its rationalism. Each case is presented with a physical examination, a diagnosis, a prognosis, which the author candidly categorizes as favorable, uncertain, or untreatable, and a recommended treatment, with no magical content whatsoever in the surgical cases, suggesting that Egyptian physicians distinguished clearly between conditions that responded to physical intervention and those that required supernatural assistance. Egyptian physicians were known throughout the ancient world for their skill, their services sought by foreign rulers from the kings of Persia to the pharaohs of neighboring states, and their particular expertise in the treatment of eye diseases, intestinal disorders, and the injuries sustained in warfare, and in the physically demanding labor of the construction projects that defined Egyptian civilization, making them the closest equivalent to a professional medical corps that the ancient world possessed. Fact 22, Egyptian mathematics and astronomy, minds that measured the universe. The intellectual achievements of ancient Egypt in mathematics and astronomy were not, by the standards of the Babylonian or later Greek traditions, the most theoretically sophisticated of the ancient world. The Egyptians showed relatively little interest in the kind of abstract mathematical reasoning for its own sake that characterized the Babylonian algebraic tradition, but they were eminently practical, focused on solving the specific problems that the management of a complex agricultural and monumental civilization required, and sufficient in their precision to produce the Great Pyramid's extraordinary dimensional accuracy. The agricultural calendar, whose alignment with the annual Nile flood sustained the civilization for 3,000 years. And the astronomical knowledge, whose application oriented the temples and the tombs in ways that gave them their particular relationship to the movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars. The Rhind Mathematical Papyrus, purchased in Luxor in 1858 by the Scottish antiquary Alexander Henry Rhind and now in the British Museum, dating to approximately 1550 BCE and containing 84 mathematical problems with their solutions, reveals an Egyptian mathematical tradition proficient in the manipulation of fractions, the calculation of areas and volumes, the estimation of the slope of pyramid faces using the seat system, and the practical arithmetic of the tax collector and the grain distributor, whose daily work required the rapid and accurate calculation of quantities that no abacus could manage alone. In astronomy, the Egyptians developed one of the earliest solar calendars in history, a 365-day year of 12 months of 30 days each with 5 additional epigonal days, whose alignment with the heliacal rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, whose first appearance above the eastern horizon just before dawn reliably preceded the annual Nile flood by a few days, gave the calendar its agricultural precision. The ceiling of the tomb of Senenmut, Hatshepsut's chief official, bears one of the earliest known astronomical charts, mapping the northern and southern skies in a visual vocabulary that reveals a sustained and serious observation of the heavens, whose practical application to the orientation of the temples and the timing of the religious festivals was as important to the Egyptian state as the mathematics of the construction site. Fact 23. Egyptian agriculture, feeding the civilization. The agricultural system of ancient Egypt was, for most of the civilization's 3,000-year span, the most productive and the most stable in the ancient world. A system whose extraordinary efficiency derived not from technological sophistication, but from the perfect alignment between the annual rhythm of the Nile flood and the agricultural calendar. A natural subsidy of fertility so reliable and so generous that Egyptian farmers could achieve yields of grain per unit of land that farmers in other ancient civilizations could not approach, and that generated the agricultural surplus whose accumulation in the royal granaries sustained the armies, the construction workers, the priests, the bureaucrats, and the artisans on whose combined labor the civilization rested. The agricultural year began with the recession of the Nile flood in October or November, when the farmers emerged from their elevated villages to find the fields covered with a fresh layer of the dark silt, whose particular fertility was the gift of the Ethiopian highlands thousands of kilometers upstream, where the seasonal rains fed the Blue Nile with the mineral-rich sediment that the flood carried northward to the Egyptian fields. The primary crops were emmer wheat and barley, the raw materials of the two dietary staples, bread and beer, that constituted the basic diet of every Egyptian from the pharaoh to the lowest agricultural laborer, and that were used as the primary medium of payment in an economy that had no coinage before the late period. Flax was grown for linen, the fabric from which virtually all Egyptian clothing was made, and whose quality ranged from the coarse linen of the working classes to the extraordinary fine-woven royal linen, so transparent that Herodotus described it as woven sunshine. That was the ultimate luxury textile of the ancient Mediterranean world. The management of the agricultural surplus, its collection as tax, its storage in the state granaries, and its distribution to the workers who built the monuments and staffed the temples, was the primary function of the Egyptian bureaucratic apparatus, the practical foundation on which the entire superstructure of Egyptian civilization was built, and the reason why the pharaoh's most important title in practical terms was not God King but Granary Master of the world. Fact 24. The Rosetta Stone, the key that unlocked a civilization. The Rosetta Stone, a granodiorite stele discovered by French soldiers of Napoleon's Egyptian expedition in July 1799 at the town of Rashid, known to the Europeans as Rosetta, in the western Nile Delta, inscribed with a decree issued by the priests of Memphis in 196 BCE, celebrating the benefactions of the young Ptolemaic pharaoh Ptolemy V, and recording that decree in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic Egyptian for the priests, Demotic Egyptian for the general population, and Greek for the Macedonian ruling class, is not the most beautiful object to survive from ancient Egypt, nor the most historically significant in its original content, but it is the object whose modern significance surpasses every other artifact in the entire Egyptian collection, because it was the key that unlocked the entire civilization. The parallel text that allowed, for the first time in more than 14 centuries, the reading of the hieroglyphic script that covered every temple wall and every tomb corridor and every royal monument in Egypt, a script whose meaning had been entirely lost with the death of the last person trained to read it in the 5th century CE. The decipherment of the Rosetta Stone was the greatest single act of scholarly detective work in the history of archaeology. Conducted in parallel and in competition by 2 of the most gifted linguistic minds of the early 19th century, the English polymath Thomas Young made the crucial early breakthrough in 1814, identifying the oval cartouches in the hieroglyphic text as royal names and correctly assigning phonetic values to several of the signs that spelled the name Ptolemy. The French scholar Jean-François Champollion, building on Young's work and bringing to bear his extraordinary command of Coptic, the last descendant of the ancient Egyptian language, still used in the liturgy of the Egyptian Christian Church, achieved the decisive decipherment in September 1822, recognizing the bilingual nature of the script, publishing his findings in his letter à M. Dacia, and weeping by his own account before collapsing from exhaustion. He had given Egypt back its voice. Fact 25. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh. Cleopatra VII Philopator, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt, born in approximately 69 BCE into the Macedonian Greek dynasty, founded by Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's generals, who had ruled Egypt since 305 BCE while maintaining the forms of Egyptian royal tradition. A woman who was the first member of her dynasty in nearly 3 centuries to speak the Egyptian language, who also spoke 8 others including Ethiopian, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Parthian, who allied herself successively with the 2 most powerful Roman men of her era, Julius Caesar, by whom she had a son, Caesarion, and Mark Antony, by whom she had 3 children, in a sustained and ultimately unsuccessful attempt to maintain Egyptian independence against the expanding power of Rome, and who died by her own hand in August 30 BCE following Antony's defeat at the Battle of Actium, becoming in death the most romanticized figure in the entire history of the ancient world, was not, in the popular imagination, the figure the historical record reveals. The Cleopatra of history was above all a politician of extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary nerve, a ruler who reclaimed her throne from her brother at 21 by having herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters rolled in a carpet or a linen sack, who governed one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the Mediterranean world for more than 2 decades, who understood that Rome would eventually absorb Egypt, and who devoted her entire political career to delaying and if possible preventing that absorption, and who chose death over the humiliation of being paraded through Rome in Octavian's triumph, with the cold strategic calculation of a person who understood that her posthumous reputation was the last political tool available to her. The Egypt that Cleopatra ruled had already been, for 3 centuries, a Hellenized kingdom in which the ancient Egyptian religious and cultural traditions were maintained for political legitimacy rather than lived conviction. But her death in 30 BCE brought that kingdom to its end, and with it the last thread of continuity with the civilization that had built the pyramids 25 centuries before. Fact 26. Egyptian trade, the empire of exchange. Ancient Egypt was not the self-sufficient, inward-looking civilization that its desert borders and its agricultural abundance might suggest. It was from the earliest dynasties onward, an active participant in the trade networks of the ancient Near East and the Eastern Mediterranean, exchanging the grain, linen, and papyrus that the Nile Valley produced in surplus for the timber, metal, and luxury goods that Egypt's geology and geography denuded, and projecting its commercial and military reach into the territories of Nubia to the south, the Levant to the northeast, and the mysterious land of Punt to the southeast, in a pattern of economic engagement, whose particulars reveal a civilization far more cosmopolitan and far more connected to the wider ancient world than the popular image of Egypt as a sealed world of pyramids and pharaohs suggests. Timber was Egypt's most critical import. A civilization that built on the monumental scale that Egypt achieved required enormous quantities of cedar, the most prized structural and naval timber of the ancient Mediterranean, which grew only in the mountains of Lebanon and whose importation was managed through the port of Byblos, the Phoenician city on the Lebanese coast whose name, meaning papyrus, reflects the centrality of Egyptian trade to its own identity. The trade with Nubia, the territory to the south of the first Nile cataract that the Egyptians called Kush, was the most ancient and the most consistently profitable of Egypt's commercial relationships. The gold of the Nubian desert constituting the primary source of the metal, whose abundance in Egypt astonished every ancient visitor, and whose deployment in the construction of the divine images, the royal regalia, and the funerary equipment of the elite, was both the most visible expression of Egyptian wealth and the primary medium through which Egypt purchased its diplomatic influence in the ancient Near East. The trading expedition to Punt commissioned by Hatshepsut and commemorated in the reliefs of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, showing the Egyptian ships loading myrrh trees, ebony, ivory, and live animals under the direction of the obese Queen of Punt, whose particular physical appearance has fascinated medical historians for generations, is the most detailed surviving account of an ancient trading expedition and a reminder that the Egyptians were sailors as well as builders, reaching by sea into territories whose exact location we still cannot identify with certainty. Fact 27. The Egyptian military, armies of the god king. The military history of ancient Egypt spans 3,000 years of campaigns, conquests, and defensive wars whose particular character, the defense of the Nile Valley against the desert peoples of Libya to the west, the Nubian kingdoms to the south, and the successive powers of the Levant and the Near East to the northeast, shaped the physical extent of the Egyptian state and the particular military institutions through which that state projected its power. The earliest Egyptian armies were levies of agricultural workers, conscripted for specific campaigns and then returned to their fields, whose equipment was limited to the bows, clubs, and flint-tipped spears available to a civilization that did not yet have access to bronze. The transformative event in Egyptian military history was the Hyksos invasion of approximately 1650 BCE, the conquest of Lower Egypt by the Semitic people from the Levant known to the Egyptians as the Hyksos, whose possession of the bronze weapons, the composite bow, and above all the horse-drawn chariot that the Egyptians had never encountered gave them a military advantage against which the existing Egyptian forces had no answer. resulting in the establishment of a Hyksos dynasty in the Delta that ruled northern Egypt for approximately 100 years. The expulsion of the Hyksos by the Theban princes, who founded the 18th dynasty, was accomplished using the very weapons and the very tactics that the Hyksos had introduced, the Egyptians adopting the chariot, the composite bow, and the bronze weapon with an enthusiasm that transformed their military from a defensive levy into the professional, mobile, and aggressive force with which Thutmose III, the greatest military pharaoh of the New Kingdom, conducted 17 campaigns into the Levant and created an empire extending from the Fourth Nile Cataract in the south to the Euphrates River in the north, the largest empire in the ancient world at the time of its maximum extent. Fact 28. Egyptian women, status in the ancient world. The status of women in ancient Egyptian society was, by the standards of the ancient world, remarkably elevated, a fact that consistently surprises modern students of the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, where the subordination of women to male authority in virtually every legal, economic, and social domain was so complete and so universally assumed that the relative freedom and legal equality of Egyptian women appears as an anomaly whose explanation has occupied Egyptologists for generations. Egyptian women of all social classes could own property in their own names, inherit from their parents on equal terms with their brothers, conduct business independently, enter into legal contracts, bring cases before the courts, and initiate divorce proceedings, rights that their counterparts in classical Athens, ancient Rome, and most subsequent Western civilizations would not enjoy for 2,000 years or more. The legal equality of Egyptian women was reflected in the practical reality of daily life, as documented in the surviving records. Women are found in the papyri as landowners, traders, witnesses to legal documents, and plaintiffs in legal disputes, conducting their economic lives with a degree of independence that the documents record without comment, suggesting that contemporaries found nothing unusual in it. The occupational range available to women was, however, considerably narrower than that available to men. The great bureaucratic and priestly offices of the Egyptian state were almost exclusively male preserves, and the physical labor of the construction sites and the agricultural fields was performed by men. Women's most valued public roles were in the temple, as singers, musicians, and dancers in the service of the gods, particularly the goddess Hathor, and as the god's wife of Ammon, a religious office of extraordinary prestige whose holder wielded, at the height of its influence in the Third Intermediate Period, a political and economic authority in the Theban region that rivaled that of the pharaoh in the north. That some women reached the highest office of all, Hatshepsut the most famous, Neferneferuiten and Sopneferu among the others, was unusual but not, in the Egyptian understanding of kingship, impossible. Fact 29. The Karnak Temple Complex, the largest religious building ever built. The temple complex of Karnak, situated on the east bank of the Nile at Thebes, the religious capital of Egypt during the New Kingdom period, and dedicated primarily to the god Amun-Ra, whose cult, at the height of its influence, controlled a proportion of the land and wealth of Egypt that made the Amun priesthood the most powerful institutional force in the country after the pharaoh, is the largest religious building complex ever constructed in the history of humanity. Its total area of approximately 2 square kilometers containing within it not a single temple, but a layered accumulation of temples, chapels, pylons, obelisks, sacred lakes, and processional avenues built by successive pharaohs across a period of more than 2,000 years, from the Middle Kingdom rulers of approximately 2000 BCE to the Ptolemaic rulers of the 1st century BCE, each adding their own contribution to a complex whose scale and whose complexity defy any simple description. The Hypostyle Hall of Karnak, built primarily during the reigns of Seti I and Rameses II of the 19th dynasty, a forest of 134 massive stone columns arranged in 16 rows, the 12 central columns rising to a height of 23 meters and supporting a ceiling of stone slabs, the entire surface of every column and every wall covered with the carved and painted reliefs of royal and divine scenes whose original colors, traces of which survive in the protected interior surfaces, were as vivid as any painting, is the single most impressive interior architectural space to survive from the ancient world, a space whose experience of scale, of darkness relieved by shafts of light through the clerestory windows above the central aisle, and of the accumulated weight of the divine imagery that covers every surface has reduced visitors to silence since the first Greek travelers described it in the 5th century BCE. The avenue of ram-headed sphinxes that connected Karnak to the Temple of Luxor 3 kilometers to the south, recently restored to its full length after centuries of encroachment by the modern city, gives the visitor today something of the experience of the ancient processional festivals, in which the statue of Ammon was carried in his sacred bark from Karnak to Luxor and back, the god traveling through a landscape of stone that his own wealth had built. Facts 30. Ancient Egypt at 30. 30 facts into the history of ancient Egypt, and the civilization has grown more intimate, closer to the lives of the people who lived it, to the hands that measured the grain and healed the sick, and navigated the trade routes, and stood before the scale in the Hall of Two Truths. We have watched the physicians of the Edwin Smith Papyrus examine their patients with a clinical precision that would not be equaled in the Western medical tradition for another 2,000 years. We have followed the mathematics of the seat calculation up the slope of the pyramid and the astronomy of Sirius rising above the horizon in the pre-dawn sky. We have stood in the flooded fields as the Nile receded and understood that the black soil it left behind was not merely earth but the gift of the gods, the annual renewal of the covenant between the river and the people who depended on it for everything. We have watched Champollion weep as the hieroglyphs yielded their meaning for the first time in 14 centuries, and understood that the decipherment of the Rosetta Stone was not merely a scholarly achievement, but an act of resurrection, the return of a voice that had been silent since late antiquity. We have followed Cleopatra to her end, and felt the particular sadness of a civilization's last breath. We have walked through the hypostyle hall at Karnak in the half-dark, surrounded by columns taller than anything the modern world builds in stone, and felt what the ancient Egyptians intended every visitor to feel, the absolute smallness of the human being in the presence of the divine. 70 facts remain, the story deepens still. Rest now in the quiet of the ancient dark. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 31. The Middle Kingdom, Egypt's classical age. Middle Kingdom of ancient Egypt, the period spanning approximately 2055 to 1650 BCE, beginning with the reunification of the country under the Theban pharaoh Mentuhotep II following the fragmentation and civil conflict of the First Intermediate Period, and ending with the Hyksos invasion that established foreign rule over Lower Egypt, is regarded by Egyptologists as the classical age of Egyptian civilization, the period in which the literary, artistic, and administrative traditions of the culture reached what many scholars consider their highest level of formal refinement, and in which the particular qualities that define the Egyptian aesthetic, the measured elegance of the royal portraiture, the psychological depth of the funerary literature, the architectural restraint of the temple building, achieved a balance and a maturity that the more flamboyant grandeur of the New Kingdom would surpass in scale, but not always in quality. The literature of the Middle Kingdom is the richest body of creative writing to survive from the ancient Egyptian tradition, encompassing the story of Sinew, whose account of the Egyptian official who flees to Canaan following a palace crisis and spends decades in exile before returning to die in Egypt, told in a voice of psychological subtlety and personal emotion that anticipates the literary novel by more than 3,000 years. The shipwrecked sailor, the instructions of Amenemhat, and the dialogue of a man who contemplates suicide with his soul. The last of these a text of such extraordinary philosophical candor, in its confrontation with the desire for death, that it has been compared to the Book of Job by every scholar who has encountered it. The administrative reforms of the Middle Kingdom pharaohs, who reorganized the provincial government after the decentralization of the First Intermediate Period, created the office of the vizier as the primary administrative official below the pharaoh, and systematized the taxation and labor conscription that sustained the state. Created the bureaucratic framework that the New Kingdom would inherit, and that would manage the most complex civilization of the ancient world across the centuries of its greatest territorial extent. The royal portraits of Amenemhat III and Senwosret III from the Middle Kingdom are in their extraordinary psychological realism. The lined faces, the heavy-lidded eyes, the expressions of burden and of age, the most individually human royal images in 3,000 years of Egyptian art, a quality whose deliberate departure from the idealized serenity of Old Kingdom royal portraiture reflects a specific theological and political program. The Middle Kingdom pharaoh presented himself not as a remote divine being, but as a suffering shepherd, a king who bore the weight of his people's welfare in his own body, and whose lined face was the visible testimony of that burden. Fact 32. The Hyksos, the foreigners who changed Egypt forever. The Hyksos, whose name derives from the Egyptian Hekakasat, meaning rulers of foreign lands, and who represented the first successful conquest of Egypt by a foreign power in the civilization's history, arrived in the Egyptian delta not as a sudden military invasion, but as the culmination of a gradual migration of Semitic peoples from Canaan and the Levant that had been underway since the Middle Kingdom period. Their settlement in the eastern delta, concentrating over the course of the late Middle Kingdom into a community of sufficient size and military organization to take advantage of the political weakness that accompanied the end of the 13th dynasty and establish their own ruling dynasty, the 15th, whose capital at Avaris in the eastern delta became the most cosmopolitan city in the Egypt of its time. The Hyksos period, approximately 1650 to 1550 BCE, has traditionally been portrayed in the Egyptian historical tradition, and consequently in much of the modern scholarship that relied on that tradition, as a catastrophic interruption of Egyptian civilization. A time of chaos and oppression from which the heroic Theban pharaohs of the late 17th dynasty delivered Egypt through a war of liberation, whose culmination in the expulsion of the Hyksos under Ahmose I became one of the founding narratives of the New Kingdom state. This portrayal is now understood to be substantially a product of New Kingdom propaganda rather than historical reality. The Hyksos rulers adopted Egyptian royal titles, worshipped Egyptian gods alongside their own, patronized Egyptian craftsmen, and administered the territory under their control using the existing Egyptian bureaucratic apparatus. The relationship between ruler and ruled was exploitative in the way that all ancient conquest was exploitative, but it was not the cultural catastrophe that the later Egyptian tradition described. What the Hyksos brought to Egypt was more consequential than what they took from it. The composite bow, whose laminated construction of wood, horn and sinew gave it a range and a penetrating power that the simple self-bow could not match. The horse-drawn chariot, which transformed the character of ancient Near Eastern warfare from a primarily infantry affair to a mobile, fast-moving engagement in which speed of maneuver was as important as weight of numbers. And the vertical loom and the olive tree, whose introduction into the Egyptian agricultural and textile economy expanded both the dietary range and the craft repertoire of the civilization that would use the military technology it had absorbed from the Hyksos to build the greatest empire of the Bronze Age. Fact 33. Thutmose III, Egypt's greatest warrior king. Thutmose III, the sixth pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, who ruled Egypt for approximately 54 years from 1479 to 1425 BCE, and who is regarded by most military historians of the ancient world as the greatest commander in Egyptian history, and one of the most gifted military strategists of the entire ancient Near East, spent the first 22 years of his reign as the subordinate co-regent of his stepmother Hatshepsut, who effectively governed Egypt during this period, while Thutmose held the formal military command, but exercised little independent authority, and who left him at her death in approximately 1458 BCE, an Egypt whose administrative efficiency and economic prosperity provided the perfect platform for the military campaigns that would occupy the next 3 decades of his reign and transform Egypt from a regional power into the dominant empire of the Bronze Age world. Thutmose conducted 17 military campaigns into the Levant, Nubia, and Syria across the 30 years following Hatshepsut's death, each campaign meticulously recorded in the annals inscribed on the walls of the Temple of Amun at Karnak, the most detailed military records to survive from the ancient Egyptian tradition, whose particular value to military historians lies in their unusual specificity about routes of march, logistical arrangements, and the tactical decisions that preceded each major engagement. The campaign that defined his military reputation was the first, the march to Megiddo in 1457 BCE, where a coalition of Canaanite and Syrian princes under the leadership of the king of Kadesh had assembled in the strategically critical fortress city of Megiddo to resist the reimposition of Egyptian authority in the Levant. Thutmose's war council presented him with 3 possible routes of advance, 2 longer, safer routes around the Carmel Ridge, and 1 direct but extremely dangerous route through the narrow Aruna Pass, wide enough for only a single file of soldiers, which would leave the army dangerously strung out during the passage. Thutmose chose the dangerous route, calculating correctly that the enemy commanders would concentrate their forces against the safer approaches and leave the pass lightly defended, and emerged from the pass at the head of his army to find the enemy unprepared for battle on the plain of Megiddo, winning a decisive engagement that the Egyptian annals record with the observation that the capture of Megiddo was worth the capture of 1,000 cities. The empire he built through these 17 campaigns extended from the Fourth Nile Cataract in the south to the Euphrates River in the north, making Egypt the greatest territorial power in the ancient world at the height of its New Kingdom expansion. Fact 34. The Amarna period, Egypt's most radical revolution. The Amarna period, the 18 years of the reign of Akhenaten, approximately 1353 to 1336 BCE, during which the pharaoh imposed on Egypt the most complete and the most rapidly executed religious revolution in the history of the ancient world, dismantling the traditional polytheistic religion, closing the temples of the gods, redirecting the enormous resources of the temple estates to the sole worship of the Aten, and relocating the capital of Egypt to a virgin site in Middle Egypt, whose very ground had never been consecrated to any previous deity, was the most consequential and the most thoroughly reversed episode in Egyptian religious history. Its particular combination of theological radicalism, artistic innovation, and administrative disruption leaving scars on Egyptian civilization, whose depth can be measured by the ferocity with which the subsequent tradition sought to erase every trace of it. The city of Akhetaten, built with astonishing speed on the cliffs and plain of the site now called Amarna, its construction completed within a few years of the decision to build it, its population at its height, estimated at between 20 and 50,000 people, was defined by the boundary stele that Akhenaten had carved into the cliffs at intervals around its perimeter, on which he proclaimed his intention never to leave the city and never to allow its boundaries to be expanded. Declarations whose literal fulfillment confined the court and the government of Egypt to a single site in a way that created serious administrative difficulties as the reign progressed. The theological content of Atenism as Akhenaten practiced it was a form of solar monotheism, whose principal innovation was the removal of the mythological dimension of Egyptian religion. The Aten had no myths, no family, no enemies, no narrative, and whose sole mediation between the human community and the divine was the person of Akhenaten himself, who declared himself the only one who knew the Aten and through whom all worship must pass. Creating a theology whose absolute concentration of religious authority in the pharaoh's person was without precedent in Egyptian history. The consequences of this concentration, the removal of the traditional mediating structures of the priesthood, the closure of the temples whose social functions extended far beyond the purely religious, and the disruption of the international diplomatic relationships whose maintenance had sustained Egyptian power in the Levant, were severe enough that by the end of Akhenaten's reign the Egyptian empire in Asia was in serious disarray. A condition that his successors spent the first decades of the 19th dynasty working to reverse. Fact 35. The Nubian pharaohs when Africa ruled Egypt. The 25th dynasty of Egypt, the period from approximately 747 to 656 BCE, during which the rulers of the Kushite kingdom of Nubia, whose capital was at Napata near the Fourth Nile Cataract deep in the Sudanese interior, conquered and ruled Egypt as its legitimate pharaohs, represents one of the most remarkable episodes in the entire history of Egyptian civilization, and one of the most consistently underrepresented in the popular understanding of the ancient world. The period in which the civilization whose monuments and traditions define the modern imagination of ancient Egypt was governed by rulers from sub-Saharan Africa, men whose dark skin and whose origins in the territory that Egypt had for centuries exploited as a source of gold, slaves, and exotic goods, made their assumption of the double crown one of the most dramatic reversals in the political history of the ancient Near East. The Nubian conquest of Egypt was not, in the understanding of the Kushite rulers who accomplished it, an alien invasion but a restoration, a rescue of the authentic Egyptian religious and cultural tradition from the hands of the politically fragmented and theologically lax Libyan dynasties of the Third Intermediate Period, whose pharaohs the Kushite kings regarded as usurpers of a tradition they themselves had preserved more faithfully in their southern kingdom than it had been maintained in Egypt itself. Kushite pharaohs Patni, Shabaka, Shebitku, Tahaka, and Tantamani governed Egypt with an intense reverence for its religious traditions, building and restoring temples, supporting the Amun priesthood at Karnak with exceptional generosity, and presenting themselves in their royal portraiture and their inscriptions in the most orthodox Egyptian royal idiom, their faces in the surviving sculpture distinguished from those of their Egyptian predecessors primarily by the double uraeus they wore above the forehead. A unique iconographic innovation, two cobras rather than one, symbolizing their sovereignty over both Egypt and Kush. Tahaka, the greatest of the Nubian pharaohs, whose reign of approximately 26 years from 690 to 664 BCE was marked by an ambitious building program in both Egypt and Nubia, whose military confrontation with the Assyrian Empire of Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal is mentioned in the Bible, built the tallest columns ever erected in an Egyptian temple in the forecourt of Karnak, and constructed pyramids in Nubia whose steep-sided form, reviving a tradition that Egypt itself had abandoned 15 centuries earlier, would continue to be built by the Kushite civilization for another 1,000 years after the Egyptian pyramid tradition had ended. Fact 36. Egyptian obelisks, the fingers of the sun god. The obelisk, the tall, tapering, four-sided monolithic stone shaft topped by the pyramid-shaped pyramidion, whose original gilded surface caught the first light of the rising sun and scattered it across the landscape in a flash of gold that the ancient Egyptians understood as the visible moment of the sun god's daily reappearance, is the most widely distributed artifact of ancient Egyptian civilization in the modern world, its particular combination of visual drama, structural simplicity, and transportability having made it the architectural trophy most consistently carried off from Egypt by the successive conquerors and admirers of Egyptian civilization, from the Roman emperors who transporting 13 obelisks to Rome, where more ancient Egyptian obelisks stand today than in Egypt itself, to the 19th century governments of Britain, France, and the United States, who each received one of the so-called Cleopatra's Needles. Obelisks of Thutmose III that now stand on the Victoria Embankment in London, in the Place de la Concorde in Paris, and in Central Park in New York. The original function of the obelisk was inseparable from the solar theology of the Egyptian state. The obelisk was the Benben, the primordial mound on which the sun god first manifested at the moment of creation, and its placement in pairs flanking the entrance pylons of the great temples expressed the theological claim that the temple entrance was the threshold between the created world and the uncreated divine reality from which the sun god had emerged. The granite obelisks of ancient Egypt were quarried, carved, transporting, and erected with a logistical precision that modern engineers have found difficult to fully replicate. The unfinished obelisk still lying in the granite quarry at Aswan, abandoned when a crack appeared in the stone during the carving process, offers the most direct evidence of the technique, its dimensions suggesting a finished height of approximately 42 meters and a weight of approximately 1,200 tons. The largest single stone object ever attempted in ancient Egypt, whose completion would have made it the tallest obelisk in history. The transport of the finished obelisks down the Nile on specially built barges, and their erection at the temple sites using earthen ramps and rope systems, whose precise engineering remains a matter of debate among modern scholars, represents a practical achievement whose demands on the organizational capacity of the Egyptian state were as considerable as the construction of the pyramids themselves. Fact 37. Egyptian art, a language of eternity. Egyptian art, the extraordinarily consistent visual tradition, maintained across more than 3,000 years of continuous practice, from the carved ivory and painted pottery of the pre-dynastic period to the temple reliefs of the Ptolemaic era, a tradition whose particular combination of formal convention and technical mastery produced the most immediately recognizable aesthetic in the history of the ancient world, was not in its own self-understanding art in the modern sense of creative individual expression, but a visual language whose primary function was religious and magical, the making permanent, endurable materials of the realities whose continued existence in the painted or carved image was understood to sustain both the cosmic order and the individual existence of the people depicted. The conventions that govern Egyptian two-dimensional representation, the composite view that presents the human body with the head in profile, the eye frontal, the shoulders frontal, and the hips and legs in profile, a convention that strikes the modern eye as anatomically distorted, but that the Egyptians understood as the most complete possible presentation of the human form, showing each part from its most characteristic angle, were not the product of an inability to observe natural form. As the extraordinary naturalism of many Egyptian animal representations demonstrates, but the deliberate choice of a representational system whose purpose was not illusionistic accuracy, but the maximal symbolic completeness of the image. The Egyptian canon of proportions, the grid system that governed the placement of figures in the two-dimensional field, dividing the standing human figure into 18 squares from the sole of the foot to the hairline with each body part assigned to a specific grid position, was the most systematic approach to representational art in the ancient world and the closest thing to a universal standard that ancient art possessed. Its consistency across 3,000 years of production, explaining the remarkable stability of the Egyptian visual style that strikes every modern viewer as the civilization's most immediately recognizable characteristic. Within these conventions, however, the finest Egyptian artists achieved effects of beauty, movement, and psychological expressiveness that transcend the formal system they worked within: the painted geese of Madam, the hunting scenes of the Theban tomb paintings, the portrait heads of the royal sculptors, works that reward extended looking with the same quality of inexhaustible presence that the greatest art of any tradition provides. Fact 38. The Egyptian priests, servants of the gods. The priesthood of ancient Egypt, the institution through which the relationship between the human community and the divine was maintained in the formal ritual life of the state, the mediating body whose daily performance of the temple rituals sustained the gods in the supernatural vigor required for their continuing governance of the cosmos, was not, in the Egyptian understanding, a permanent spiritual vocation in the sense that Christian or Buddhist monasticism implies, but a rotating service obligation fulfilled by teams of men who served in the temple for 1 month in 4 and returned to their ordinary occupations for the remaining 3, a system whose practical effect was the distribution of the economic benefits of temple service, the food offerings that were the perquisites of the priestly office after their dedication to the god, across a much wider segment of the male population than a full-time professional priesthood would have permitted. The daily ritual in the Egyptian temple, performed in the innermost sanctuary, whose darkness was penetrated only by the light carried by the officiating priest, whose access was restricted to the highest ranks of the priestly hierarchy, followed a liturgical script of extraordinary precision, its sequence of actions replicating the morning toilet of the divine statue that inhabited the sanctuary and whose physical care was the primary priestly obligation. The breaking of the clay seal on the sanctuary door, the entrance into the divine presence with averted gaze, the removal of the statue from its naos, the removal of its clothing and the cleaning of its body with natron, the application of oil, the clothing in fresh linen garments, the application of eye paint and perfume, the presentation of food and drink offerings, and the final withdrawal from the sanctuary, with the careful smoothing away of the priest's own footprints, so that no human trace defiled the divine space. The power that the greatest priestly offices accumulated over the course of the New Kingdom, particularly the office of the High Priest of Amun at Karnak, whose control of the vast estates, the agricultural surplus, and the metalwork of the Amun temple by the end of the 20th dynasty exceeded the pharaoh's own resources, was the most consequential internal political development of the New Kingdom. Its culmination in the effective assumption of royal power by the high priests of Amun during the 21st dynasty, representing the most dramatic example in Egyptian history of the subordination of political authority to religious institutional power. Fact 39. The decline of ancient Egypt, when empires fall. The decline of ancient Egyptian civilization, the long, complex, and multiply-caused process by which the civilization that had maintained remarkable cultural and political continuity for 3,000 years gradually lost the ability to govern itself, defend its borders, and sustain the institutions that had defined its identity. Until the conquest of Alexander the Great in 332 BCE ended the last period of native Egyptian rule, and the death of Cleopatra VII in 30 BCE ended the last independent Egyptian state, was not a sudden collapse but a slow and uneven erosion whose particular character reflects the combination of internal fragmentation, foreign pressure, and the cumulative exhaustion of institutions that had been operating continuously since the beginning of the Old Kingdom. The first signs of the structural weakness that would eventually prove fatal appeared at the end of the New Kingdom, in the period following the death of Ramesses III in approximately 1155 BCE, when the combination of external pressure from the Sea Peoples, the mysterious confederation of displaced Mediterranean peoples, whose raids threatened Egypt's Levantine Empire, and whose attempted invasion of the Delta was defeated by Ramesses III in his famous naval battle. The first recorded in history, an internal economic and administrative strain produced the gradual contraction of the Egyptian state that scholars call the Bronze Age collapse, the simultaneous dissolution of virtually every major Mediterranean civilization of the late 2nd millennium BCE. The third intermediate period that followed the era from approximately 1069 to 664 BCE, during which Egypt was divided between competing dynasties, ruled at various points by Libyan, Nubian, and Assyrian powers, and governed by a political and religious establishment whose increasing fragmentation made the sustained collective action required for major building programs or successful military campaigns progressively more difficult. Represented the beginning of the end of Egypt as a self-governing great power, even as the cultural tradition it had generated continued to attract the reverence of every subsequent civilization that encountered it. The Persian conquest of 525 BCE, the Macedonian conquest of 332 BCE, and the Roman annexation of 30 BCE were the successive stages of Egypt's absorption into the larger world whose existence it had, for most of its history, managed to ignore. Fact 40. Ancient Egypt at 40. 40 facts into the history of ancient Egypt, and the full arc of the civilization has come into view. Its birth on the banks of the Nile, its 3,000 years of extraordinary continuity, and the long, slow twilight of its decline into the ancient world's greatest museum of its own former glory. We have followed the Middle Kingdom to its classical refinement, and watched the Hyksos carry in the chariot and the composite bow that would make the New Kingdom empire possible. We have marched with Thutmose III through the Aruna Pass toward Megiddo, and understood that military genius is as much about the willingness to take the dangerous route as about the numbers of soldiers on either side. We have stood in Akhenaten's desert city, and felt the particular atmosphere of a revolution that burned too hot and too fast, all the intensity of a genuinely new vision, and all the fragility of an idea that rests entirely on a single person's authority to compel it. We have watched the Nubian pharaohs arrive from the south and restore to Egypt a reverence for its own tradition that its native rulers had lost. We have run our hands along the surface of an unfinished obelisk in the Aswan quarry and felt the weight of a project abandoned mid-stroke. We have stood in the darkened sanctuary of an Egyptian temple and understood that the priest's daily care of the divine statue was not ritual theater, but the most serious work in the world, the maintenance of the cosmos itself, performed before dawn in silence by a man whose footprints had to be erased before he left. 60 facts remain. The story now turns toward the deeper questions, toward what this civilization believed, how it understood the human place in the universe, and what it left behind for every civilization that came after it. Rest now in the ancient quiet. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 41. Egyptian mythology, stories the gods told. The mythological tradition of ancient Egypt, the body of stories, cosmogonies, and divine narratives through which the Egyptians explained the origin of the world, the nature of the gods, the cycle of the seasons, and the meaning of death and rebirth, is one of the richest and most internally varied in the history of the ancient world, its particular character shaped by the absence of a single canonical mythological text comparable to the Iliad or the Theogony. A decentralization that allowed the different priestly traditions of the different cult centers to maintain their own cosmological narratives in productive tension with one another without any single tradition achieving the status of orthodox truth. The most important of the Egyptian cosmogonies was the Heliopolitan tradition, developed at the cult center of the sun god Ra at Heliopolis in the Delta, which described the origin of the universe as the self-creation of the god Atum, who rose from the primordial waters of chaos on the first land, the primordial mound, and generated from his own body the first divine couple, Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture, from whom descended Jeb, the earth god, and Nut, the sky goddess, and from their union Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys, the four children whose conflicts and alliances constitute the central narrative drama of Egyptian mythology. The Osiris myth, whose narrative of the murder of Osiris by his jealous brother Seth, the dismemberment and scattering of the body, the devoted reassembly by his wife Isis, the posthumous conception and birth of the heir Horus, and the eventual triumph of Horus over Seth in the divine tribunal, is the most narratively complex and theologically rich story in the Egyptian tradition, encoding in its characters and its plot the Egyptian understanding of death and resurrection. The legitimate succession of royal authority, the power of devoted love to overcome even mortality, and the ultimate triumph of order over chaos that the Egyptians called Maat. The story of Isis and Osiris was told and retold across 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization, and survived the end of that civilization itself, the cult of Isis spreading across the Hellenistic and Roman worlds, and persisting in active worship until the 5th century CE, making the myth of the devoted wife who searches the earth for the scattered body of her murdered husband one of the longest-lived religious narratives in human history. Fact 42. The weighing of the heart, Egypt's moral universe. The scene of the weighing of the heart, the central episode of the Egyptian afterlife mythology, depicted in the illustrated papyri of the Book of the Dead, and painted on the walls of New Kingdom tombs with a consistency and a detail that reveals its centrality to the Egyptian understanding of moral accountability, is the most powerful visual expression of the Egyptian conviction that the universe is a moral order, that the conduct of a human life has consequences that extend beyond the grave, and that the divine administration of justice is neither arbitrary nor corruptible, but weighs each soul with a precision that the pan of the scale makes visible. The scene is set in the Hall of Two Truths, presided over by Osiris seated on his throne, attended by 42 assessor gods, each responsible for judging a specific category of moral failure. The heart of the deceased, understood as the seat of consciousness, the memory, and the moral record of the individual's life, is placed on one pan of a great balance scale. On the other pan rests the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order, whose lightness is the standard against which the weight of a human life is measured. The jackal-headed god Anubis adjusts the plumb line of the scale, while the ibis-headed Thoth, the god of writing and wisdom, records the verdict on his palette. The composite monster Amit, part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile, crouches beside the scale, waiting to devour the heart of the unworthy and condemn the failed soul to the second death, the annihilation from which there is no return. The declaration of innocence that the deceased recites before the 42 assessors, a list of sins the speaker denies having committed, ranging from murder and theft to the defilement of sacred spaces, the corruption of measures, and the causing of unnecessary suffering to animals, is the most comprehensive surviving statement of Egyptian moral values, its particular combination of prohibitions against violence, dishonesty, sexual impropriety, economic exploitation, and the abuse of power, revealing a moral universe whose concerns are recognizably those of every serious ethical tradition in the history of humanity. The Egyptians did not invent the concept of moral judgment after death, but they depicted it with a clarity and a specificity that no other ancient tradition matched. Fact 43: Egyptian astronomy and the calendar, ordering time. The ancient Egyptians were among the most systematic observers of the sky in the ancient world, not in the theoretical sense of the Babylonian astronomers, who developed the mathematical models of planetary motion that would eventually underpin Greek astronomy, but in the practical sense of a civilization whose agricultural calendar, whose religious festival cycle, and whose funerary orientation practices all depended on the careful observation and recording of astronomical phenomena, whose recurrence defined the structure of Egyptian time. The Egyptian civil calendar, a 365-day year of 12 months of 30 days each, supplemented by 5 epagomenal days associated with the mythological birthdays of Osiris, Horus, Seth, Isis, and Nephthys, was the first solar calendar in history and the direct ancestor, through the Julian and Gregorian reforms, of the calendar in use throughout the world today. Its anchor in the astronomical year was the heliacal rising of Sirius, the star the Egyptians called Sopdet, identified with the goddess Isis, whose first appearance above the eastern horizon just before dawn, after a period of approximately 70 days of invisibility, preceded the annual Nile flood by a few weeks, and marked the beginning of the Egyptian New Year with a celestial event, whose reliability over centuries of observation gave the calendar its agricultural precision. The orientation of the Egyptian temples and tombs reveals a sophisticated understanding of astronomical alignments, whose intentionality modern archaeoastronomers have confirmed in structures ranging from the Great Pyramid, whose 4 sides are aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of better than 1/10 of a degree, to the Temple of Abu Simbel, whose inner sanctuary is illuminated by the rising sun on precisely 2 days each year, to the tomb of Senenmut at Deir el-Bahri, whose ceiling contains the earliest known planisphere, a circular map of the night sky that charts the positions of the northern and southern constellations with a comprehensiveness that implies centuries of systematic observation. The 36 decans, the groups of stars whose successive heliacal risings at 10-day intervals throughout the year, served as the primary timekeeping system for the Egyptian night, each decan governing a 10-day period and their sequence providing the basis for the Egyptian division of the night into 12 hours, were the foundation of the astrological tradition that passed from Egypt into Hellenistic astrology and thence into the Western astrological tradition whose star signs, however transformed, retain in their names and their approximate dates the traces of an Egyptian observational tradition 3,000 years old. Fact 44: the Est Festival, when the king was reborn. The Est Festival, the great royal jubilee celebrated in ancient Egypt at the 30th year of a pharaoh's reign, and at shorter intervals thereafter, whose particular ritual program, combining the symbolic death and resurrection of the king with a ceremonial reenactment of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, and a ritual reaffirmation of the divine authority, whose renewal was the festival's primary purpose, represented the most theologically complex and the most politically significant royal ceremony in the Egyptian calendar, is among the least understood and the most fascinating of the great Egyptian religious institutions, its specific ritual content partially preserved in temple reliefs and festival records, but never described in sufficient detail by any ancient source to allow its full reconstruction, leaving its interpretation the subject of sustained scholarly debate. The theological premise of the Est Festival was the Egyptian understanding of royal divine power as a physical force that was subject to the same cycle of vitality and decline that governed every other natural process, and whose periodic renewal through ritual was as necessary to the continued functioning of the cosmic order as the annual renewal of the Nile flood. The king, at the 30th anniversary of his reign, or at earlier intervals if political circumstances required the symbolic demonstration of renewed vitality, underwent a ceremony that included a ritual of symbolic death and rebirth, a series of running ceremonies in which the king demonstrated his physical capacity to govern, the presentation of offerings to the gods of both Upper and Lower Egypt in their respective chapels at the specially constructed Est Festival court, and the recoronation whose symbolism restarted the divine clock of the royal power. The remains of the earliest known Est Festival court, at Djoser's complex at Saqqara, preserve in stone the architectural setting for a ritual that was already ancient when it was built in the 3rd dynasty. Its dummy buildings, facades with no interiors, chapels that could not be entered, suggesting that the festival operated in a symbolic space that the physical reality of the structures was sufficient to evoke without needing to provide. Some pharaohs, Amenhotep III, Ramesses II, Ramesses III celebrated multiple Est festivals in their long reigns, each one a political as well as a religious event, a demonstration to the court, the priesthood, and the Egyptian people that the divine power of the king was as full and as vital as it had been on the day of his coronation. Fact 45. Egyptian sculpture, the body made eternal. Egyptian sculpture, the three-dimensional tradition whose products range from the colossal seated figures of Ramesses II Abu, symbol to the intimate intimacy of the painted limestone bust of Nefertiti, to the tiny faience amulets placed within the bandages of the mummified dead, was governed by the same theological principles and the same formal conventions that governed Egyptian two-dimensional representation. Its primary function, the creation of a physical vessel, whose accurate portrayal of the individual's features would allow the Ka, the vital spiritual double, to recognize and inhabit it in the event that the mummy was destroyed, providing an alternative physical anchor for the soul whose preservation was the entire purpose of the funerary program. The conventions of Egyptian monumental sculpture, the blockiness of the form, the frontal rigidity of the stance, the left foot advanced in the striding pose whose slight forward movement suggests arrested action rather than rest, the hands flat on the thighs or clenched around the emblems of office, the face idealized into the serene and timeless beauty that the eternal requires, reflect a theology of duration rather than a desire for illusionistic naturalism. A choice of formal conventions whose purpose was the creation of an image capable of lasting for eternity rather than of capturing a fleeting moment of lived experience. The technical achievements of Egyptian sculptors in the carving of the hardest stones, including granite, quartzite, and basalt, with copper tools supplemented by abrasive sand, a technique whose demands required extraordinary patience and precision, are among the most remarkable in the history of world sculpture. The surfaces of the finest royal portraits polished to a smoothness and a clarity of detail that modern stone workers find difficult to replicate with modern tools. The smaller-scale sculpture of the Middle and New Kingdom periods, the intimate wooden servant figures placed in the tombs to perform labor for the deceased in the afterlife, the painted limestone models of brewers and bakers and weavers at their work, the individual portrait heads whose psychological intensity suggests observation from life rather than idealization from convention, reveals a tradition whose formal constraints coexisted with a capacity for specific human observation that the monumental tradition, for all its grandeur, could not always accommodate. Fact 46. The Egyptian economy, gold, grain, and the state. The economy of ancient Egypt was, in the technical language of modern economic history, a redistributive command economy. One in which the state, embodied in the person of the pharaoh and administered by his bureaucratic apparatus, collected the agricultural surplus generated by the Nile flood through taxation, stored it in the state granaries, and redistributed it to the workers, soldiers, priests, and officials whose labor sustained the institutions of the civilization, in a system that operated for most of its history without coinage, without markets in the modern sense, and without private economic activity on a scale that rivaled the state. The primary unit of value in the Egyptian economy was the deben, a weight of metal, most commonly copper, silver, or gold, whose standard mass of approximately 91 grams served as the reference point against which the value of commodities was expressed in the surviving economic documents, even though the actual exchange of goods typically involved the barter of one commodity for another rather than the physical transfer of the metal whose weight provided the standard. The grain that the Nile flood made possible was simultaneously the primary foodstuff, the primary fuel for the construction projects whose demand for bread and beer was enormous, the primary export commodity in Egypt's trade with the grain-poor civilizations of the ancient Near East and the Aegean, and the primary medium of payment in the domestic economy. Workers were paid in grain rations, priests received grain offerings as the perquisites of their office, and the tax obligations of the farming population were calculated and paid in grain rather than in any other commodity. Gold, whose abundance in the Nubian desert made Egypt the wealthiest gold-producing territory in the ancient Near East and whose particular quality, the Egyptians' gold was renowned throughout the ancient world for its purity, made it the most sought-after luxury import in the diplomatic gift exchanges that constituted the ancient equivalent of international finance, was the currency of Egyptian diplomacy. The medium through which the pharaohs purchased the loyalty of their Levantine vassals and the friendship of their Near Eastern peers, the Amarna letters, the archive of diplomatic correspondence found at Akhenaten's capital, preserving in cuneiform the requests of foreign kings for Egyptian gold, in terms whose urgency reveals how completely the great powers of the Bronze Age understood Egypt's metallurgical wealth as the foundation of its international political power. Fact 47. Deir el-Medina, the village that built the royal tombs. Deir el-Medina, the walled village on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, occupied from approximately 1550 to 1080 BCE by the community of skilled workmen and their families, whose particular task was the excavation, decoration, and furnishing of the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, and whose unusually high literacy rate and unusually complete documentary record. Thousands of ostraka, the limestone flakes and pottery sherds on which the villagers wrote their accounts. Letters, legal disputes, work records, and literary compositions in the hieratic script has made it the most intimately known community in the entire history of ancient Egypt, offers a view of ordinary Egyptian life whose particularity and whose humanity the monumental official record, with its eternal pharaohs and its idealized ritual scenes, almost entirely conceals. The workmen of Deir el-Medina, whose official title was servants in the place of truth, a designation that reflects the sacred character of their labor in the royal necropolis, were organized into two gangs, the right and the left, each under a foreman responsible to the chief workman who answered in turn to the vizier, working an 8-day week with the 9th and 10th days as rest days in the Egyptian 10-day week. Their working year interrupted by the numerous festival days of the Egyptian religious calendar, which the surviving attendance records suggest they observed with considerable fidelity and occasional creative expansion. The ostraka of Deir el-Medina record a world of unmistakable human ordinariness alongside its extraordinary professional context. A workman's absence from work explained as necessary because he was brewing beer, a love poem of remarkable tenderness written on a limestone flake. The detailed record of a labor strike, the first recorded in history, in approximately 1170 BCE, when the workmen under Ramesses III walked off the job to protest their unpaid rations and staged a sit-in at the mortuary temples. Their demands eventually met by the embarrassed vizier, whose failure to supply the rations had provoked the action, and the records of a court of law in which the villagers adjudicated their own disputes, cases ranging from property boundary disagreements to accusations of tomb robbery, in which some of the same men who built the royal tombs were accused of having subsequently plundered them, a circular irony that the documents record with complete judicial seriousness. Fact 48. Egyptian jewelry, beauty as protection. The jewelry of ancient Egypt, the extraordinary tradition of goldsmithing, gemstone setting, faience manufacture and beadwork whose finest products, preserved in the treasure of Tutankhamun and the jewels of the Middle Kingdom princesses found at Darsha and Lahan, represent the most technically accomplished and the most visually stunning body of personal ornament to survive from the ancient world, was not in the Egyptian understanding. Primarily decorative but simultaneously aesthetic and apotropaic, every piece of jewelry worn by a living person or placed on a mummy performed a dual function, beautifying the wearer and protecting them from the hostile forces, illness, evil, the malice of enemies, the dangers of the unseen world, against whose intrusion the correct amulet, worn or carried on the body, provided the most direct available defense. The amulet tradition, whose products range from the tiny faience jed pillar symbolizing stability, the tight knot of Isis offering the protection of the goddess, and the wedget eye of Horus guarding against injury and illness, to the elaborate pectoral ornaments of the pharaohs and the great collar necklaces whose weight and whose color vocabulary, the blue of lapis lazuli evoking the heavens, the red of carnelian evoking the life force of blood, the green of turquoise evoking fertility and regeneration, encoded a complete theological statement in a wearable form, was the most universal aspect of Egyptian religious practice, crossing every boundary of class, gender, and period, and uniting the highest royal jewel with the cheapest faience bead in the same fundamental conviction: that the body requires both physical protection and divine protection, and that the correct object worn in the correct place provides the latter as reliably as armor provides the former. The technical sophistication of the finest Egyptian jewelry, the cloisonné work of Tutankhamun's pectoral ornaments, whose individual cells of gold filled with precisely cut inlays of lapis, carnelian, turquoise, and obsidian, were manufactured without the optical aids that modern jewelers consider indispensable. The granulation technique in which tiny spheres of gold were attached to a gold surface without visible solder. The manufacture of faience, the brilliant blue-green glazed material whose complex multi-stage production process was one of the most closely guarded craft secrets of the ancient world, represents an applied chemistry and a manual dexterity whose achievements modern jewelers examine with a respect that has not diminished in 4,000 years. Fact 49. The Rosetta Stone's siblings, other bilingual keys. The Rosetta Stone, for all its singular fame in the story of Egyptological decipherment, was not the only bilingual or multilingual inscription that ancient Egypt produced. It was the most strategically useful of a class of texts whose existence reflects the multilingual reality of ancient Egypt at various points in its history. particularly in the Ptolemaic period, when the administrative necessity of communicating in Greek with the ruling class and in Egyptian with the governed population created the institutional conditions for the production of parallel texts that the decipherers of the 19th century were able to exploit. The Decree of Canopus, a trilingual stele, like the Rosetta Stone inscribed in hieroglyphic Egyptian, Demotic, and Greek, issued in 238 BCE by the priests assembled at Canopus to honor Ptolemy III and his queen Berenice for their benefactions, and for the introduction of a reform to the Egyptian calendar, and discovered in 1866 at Tanis by the Prussian Egyptologist Heinrich Brugsch, provided Champollion's successors with a crucial additional source for the verification and extension of the decipherment, its parallel texts confirming the phonetic values of hieroglyphic signs in royal names beyond those available on the Rosetta Stone, and extending the range of the legible vocabulary. The Philae obelisk, discovered on the island of Philae in the Nile near Aswan and transporting to England, where it was purchased by the antiquary William John Banks, who identified the bilingual Greek and hieroglyphic inscription on its base, and the cartouches it contained as a source of additional royal names for the decipherment, played a crucial role in Champollion's confirmation of his phonetic system by providing the name of Cleopatra in hieroglyphics, whose comparison with the name of Ptolemy, already identified on the Rosetta Stone, allowed him to establish the phonetic values of the signs they shared, the elementary but essential demonstration that the same sign represented the same sound in different names. The existence of these parallel texts, produced not for the benefit of future archaeologists, but as routine instruments of the multilingual Ptolemaic administrative apparatus, was the fortuitous circumstance on which the entire enterprise of Egyptological decipherment depended, a reminder that the most consequential historical discoveries are often the products not of design, but of the intersection between scholarly ingenuity and the accidents of preservation. Fact 50. Ancient Egypt at 50. 50 facts into the history of ancient Egypt, the exact midpoint of the journey, and the civilization has revealed itself in its full extraordinary depth. Not merely the pyramids and the pharaohs of the popular imagination, but the village where the tomb builders argued about their rations and wrote love poems on limestone flakes, the jeweler whose granulation technique we still cannot fully replicate, the astronomer who mapped the southern sky on a tomb ceiling 3,500 years ago, and the priest who smoothed away his footprints on the sanctuary floor before withdrawing from the divine presence. We have stood in the Hall of Two Truths and watched the heart weighed against the feather, and understood that the Egyptian moral universe was not a comfortable one. It demanded of the dead the same accounting that the living preferred to defer. We have followed the Est Festival through its mysterious ritual program and recognized in the symbolic death and rebirth of the king the same logic that underlies every renewal ceremony in the history of religion. We have walked through the workshops of Deir el-Medina and heard, across 32 centuries, the foreman explaining to the vizier why his men have not come to work, because their rations have not arrived, and hungry men cannot cut stone. We have held the jewelry of Tutankhamun in the mind's eye, and felt the particular quality of objects whose beauty and whose magical protection were understood as the same thing, whose gold and lapis and carnelian spoke simultaneously to the eye, and to the invisible forces whose attention the amulet was designed to attract. We have watched Champollion weep, and understood that the decipherment of the hieroglyphic script was not merely the recovery of a dead language, but the restoration of a living world. 50 facts remain. The story turns now toward the intimate details of how the ancient Egyptians lived, loved, worshipped, and wondered. Rest now in the deep quiet of the ancient night. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 51. Egyptian food and diet, what the Nile fed. The diet of ancient Egypt, sustained by the extraordinary agricultural abundance of the Nile flood plain, and supplemented by the fishing and hunting that the river and the desert margin provided, was, for the majority of the population, considerably more varied and more nutritious than the diets of most ancient agricultural civilizations, its particular character shaped by the combination of the grain surplus that the black soil produced with reliable generosity and the protein sources, fish, waterfowl, legumes, and on special occasions the beef and mutton, whose consumption was a marker of social status, that filled out a dietary profile whose adequacy is confirmed by the analysis of the skeletal remains of the workers who built the pyramids and lived in the villages of the Nile Valley. Bread and beer were the foundations of the Egyptian diet at every social level, produced from the emmer wheat and barley that the Nile flood made available in quantities sufficient to sustain a dense agricultural population with surplus left over for export. Their production intertwined in the same basic process. The grain was ground on stone querns by the women of the household, The resulting flour mixed with water to produce dough that was baked in clay molds over the fire, and whose residue, mixed with more water and left to ferment, produced the thick, nutritious, lightly alcoholic beer that the Egyptians drank in preference to water. A practical choice in a river valley where waterborne disease was a constant danger, and where the fermentation process effectively sterilized the beverage. The variety within this basic framework was considerable. The surviving accounts of rations distributed to temple workers and construction gangs list beef, fish, vegetables, figs, dates, and cooking oil alongside the basic grain allocation, and the painted scenes of food preparation in the Old Kingdom mastaba tombs, showing the entire sequence from the slaughter of cattle to the roasting of meat, from the harvesting of grapes to the pressing of wine, from the netting of fish to their splitting and drying in the sun. Reveal a food culture whose complexity and whose sensory richness the simplicity of the ration lists only partially represents. The wealthy tables of the New Kingdom elite, whose tomb paintings show banquets laden with roasted meats, stewed fowl, fresh bread in multiple shapes, cakes sweetened with honey and dates, grapes, figs, pomegranates, and jars of wine from the Delta vineyards, represent a degree of dietary abundance that very few ancient civilizations could match for the upper strata of their population, and whose particular pleasures the tomb paintings preserved for the deceased in the same spirit as the food offerings piled before the false door, the conviction that the good things of this life were worth carrying across the boundary of death. Fact 52. Egyptian childhood and education, growing up on the Nile. The experience of childhood in ancient Egypt, documented in the tomb paintings that show children playing games, in the literary texts that describe the education of scribal students, in the medical papyri that record the treatments applied to childhood illness, and in the skeletal remains of children found in the cemeteries of the Nile Valley, whose analysis reveals the patterns of growth, nutrition, and disease that shaped the physical experience of growing up in an ancient agricultural civilization, was shaped by the same fundamental conditions that defined Egyptian life at every stage: the rhythm of the Nile, the demands of the agricultural calendar, and the particular combination of physical vulnerability and social warmth that the surviving evidence of everyday Egyptian life consistently suggests. Egyptian children were nursed by their mothers for a period of up to 3 years, a practice whose practical benefit in protecting infants from waterborne disease through the passive immunity conveyed in breast milk was understood empirically, if not theoretically by the medical tradition, and whose extension well beyond the age at which solid food could be consumed reflected the particular tenderness towards small children that Egyptian art expresses in the intimate family scenes of the Amarna period and the earlier tomb paintings. The formal education available to Egyptian children was almost exclusively the province of the scribal class, the sons of officials, priests, and literate craftsmen who attended the schools attached to the temples and the government offices, where they learned to read and write in the hieratic script by copying model texts onto limestone ostraka with reed brushes. Their curriculum, moving from simple sign lists through the copying of classic literary and administrative texts to the eventual mastery of the full hieroglyphic system, reserved for the most gifted and most persistent students. The scribal education texts themselves, a genre of literary composition whose purpose was to motivate the students by contrasting the comfortable life of the educated scribe with the misery of every other profession in Egypt, describing the soldier as cold, wet, and beaten, the farmer as exhausted and perpetually in debt, the builder as permanently sunburned, and the sandal maker as permanently stinking, are among the most entertainingly partisan documents in the entire Egyptian literary tradition, their comic exaggeration presumably as transparent to their ancient audience as it is to the modern reader. Fact 53. Egyptian music and entertainment, joy on the Nile. The musical and entertainment traditions of ancient Egypt, documented in the tomb paintings that show musicians, dancers, and acrobats performing at the banquets of the wealthy, in the temple reliefs that show the ritual musicians shaking the sistrums and beating the drums before the processional statues of the gods, in the poetry of the love songs whose imagery of music and dance is inseparable from the experience of desire, and in the surviving instruments, harps, lutes, oboes, flutes, clappers, drums, and the bronze sistrum rattle, whose shaking was the primary musical act of the Hathor cult, reveal a civilization in which music and performance were not peripheral entertainments, but woven into the fabric of both the sacred and the secular life at every social level. The harp was the most prestigious of the Egyptian instruments, its development from the simple bow harp of the Old Kingdom, a single curved neck with a small number of strings, played by a single performer seated on the ground, to the tall standing arched harps of the New Kingdom, some of them taller than the musicians who played them, elaborately decorated with painted scenes and gilded surfaces. played by standing performers whose technique included both melody and a form of chordal accompaniment, tracing a musical evolution whose sophistication rivals the development of the instrument in any subsequent musical tradition. The love poetry of ancient Egypt, preserved in papyri from the New Kingdom period, composed in a voice of personal lyrical immediacy that has made it the most widely anthologized of all ancient Egyptian literary forms in the modern world, describes a world in which music, dance, and the sensory pleasures of the body are the natural companions of the experience of love. The beloved compared to a lotus flower in the breeze, the lover's heart beating faster at the sound of his love's voice, the two of them lying together in a garden of flowers, while the musicians play images of a physical joy and a tender beauty that the sobriety of the official monumental tradition entirely conceals, and that the intimate documents of private life restore with a vividness that 3,000 years has not diminished. Fact 54. Sacred animals, when gods wore fur and feathers. The Egyptian tradition of sacred animals, the practice of understanding certain animal species, and certain individual animals within those species, as the living manifestations or earthly dwelling places of the divine powers, whose particular attributes the animal's characteristics were understood to embody, is among the most distinctive and the most frequently misunderstood aspects of Egyptian religious life. Its surface exoticism concealing a theological sophistication, whose recognition requires the abandonment of the assumption that the Egyptians literally worshipped animals, in the naive sense of attributing divine status to the creature itself, rather than to the divine principle, whose presence the creature was believed to make accessible. The theological basis of Egyptian animal veneration was the concept of the Ba, the manifestation of the divine essence in a physical form, whose particular characteristics could make a specific aspect of the divine accessible to human encounter. A concept whose application to the animal world explains both why particular species were associated with particular gods, and why individual animals of those species could be identified as the living Ba of the deity, and treated with the reverence appropriate to a divine presence housed in a mortal body. The Apis bull, the most prestigious of the Egyptian sacred animals, venerated at the Temple of Ptah at Memphis as the living manifestation of the creator god Ptah, and after death of Osiris, its selection from the cattle of Egypt according to a specific set of physical marks including a white triangle on the forehead, a crescent-shaped white marking on the flank, and a knot under the tongue, its residence in luxurious stabling adjacent to the Ptah temple. Its death mourned throughout Egypt as a national bereavement, and its burial in the magnificent granite sarcophagi of the Serapeum at Saqqara was the most elaborate individual expression of the sacred animal tradition, whose underground vaults, excavated from 1850 by the French archaeologist Auguste Mariette, contained the sarcophagi of more than 60 individual Apis bulls, and provided the most dramatic physical evidence of the seriousness with which the ancient Egyptians enacted their understanding of the divine presence in the animal world. Fact 55. The Egyptian Navy, ships of the sacred river. The Egyptian naval tradition, whose origins lie in the earliest pre-dynastic craft that navigated the Nile, developed through the Old Kingdom river barges that transporting the pyramid stones from the Aswan quarries to the Giza plateau, and reached its fullest expression in the seagoing vessels that carried Egyptian trade and military power across the Mediterranean and the Red Sea during the New Kingdom period, was the essential logistical infrastructure of the Egyptian state. The means by which the extraordinary scale of the Egyptian construction program was made practically possible, and by which the commercial and military reach of the pharaoh was extended beyond the natural limits of the Nile Valley into the territories that Egypt's political and economic ambitions required it to engage. The construction of the pyramids was, at its logistical core, a river transport problem. The limestone blocks quarried at Tura on the east bank of the Nile needed to cross the river to the west bank construction site at Giza, and the granite brought from the quarries at Aswan, 500 kilometers upstream, needed to travel the length of Upper Egypt by water before it could be unloaded at the Pyramid Plateau, the surviving evidence of the harbors and causeways at Giza confirming that the primary delivery system for the pyramid stone was the annual Nile flood, whose raised water level brought the transport barges close enough to the construction site to minimize the overland hauling distance. The seagoing vessels that carried the trading expeditions to Punt and the military campaigns to the Levantine coast were a different order of vessel entirely. The Egyptian word for them, the KBNT ship, suggests their origin in the Canaanite tradition of maritime construction, their design adapted from the Levantine shipbuilding tradition to the particular demands of the Red Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean, whose open water passages required a deeper keel, a taller sail plan. and a structural strength that the flat-bottomed river barge could not provide. The naval battle fought by Ramesses III against the Sea Peoples, depicted in extraordinary detail in the reliefs of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, the largest surviving representation of a naval engagement in ancient art, shows the Egyptian fleet engaging the invaders in the confined waters of the delta mouth. Using archers on the deck and grappling hooks to overcome the larger Sea Peoples vessels in a close-quarters battle, whose outcome determined whether the civilization of the ancient Near East survived the catastrophic disruption of the 12th century BCE. Fact 56. Egyptian cosmetics and beauty, the art of appearance. The Egyptian tradition of personal adornment, whose products, tools, and raw materials survive in extraordinary abundance in the tombs and settlement sites of the Nile Valley, from the elaborate cosmetic palettes of the pre-dynastic period, whose carved stone surfaces were used to grind the mineral pigments of the earliest eye paint to the ivory, and ebony cosmetic containers of the New Kingdom elite whose shapes, women swimming, ducks preening, horses rearing, are among the most charming small objects in the entire Egyptian repertoire, was not, in the Egyptian understanding, primarily a matter of vanity, but a practice simultaneously aesthetic, hygienic, and magical. The correct application of the correct substances to the correct parts of the body serving functions that the modern distinction between beauty and medicine and religious practice does not neatly accommodate. The application of kohl, the black eye paint made from ground galena or other antimony sulfide minerals, whose characteristic thick black outline around the eyes is the most immediately recognizable feature of Egyptian personal appearance in the surviving art, was both a cosmetic practice and a medical one. The antimony compounds in kohl had genuine antibacterial properties that protected the eyes against the infections that the dust, the flies, and the waterborne bacteria of the Nile Valley environment made constant hazards, and its application in the characteristic extending, sweep beyond the outer corner of the eye toward the temple both enhanced the appearance and invoked the protection of the Wedjat Eye of Horus, the most powerful protective symbol in the Egyptian magical repertoire. The red ochre applied to the lips and the cheeks, the green malachite eyeshadow fashionable in the Old Kingdom before it was superseded by the kohl tradition, the henna used to stain the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, the elaborate wigs of human hair and vegetable fiber that both men and women of the elite wore over their shaved or closely cropped heads, and the perfumed oils and unguents whose scent was inseparable from the experience of the Egyptian elite. All of these practices participated in the Egyptian understanding of the prepared and adorned body as the appropriate vehicle for the encounter with other people, with the gods, and with the world in all its sensory fullness. Fact 57. Egyptian language, 3,000 years of a living tongue. The ancient Egyptian language, the tongue spoken on the banks of the Nile from the earliest pre-dynastic communities of the 4th millennium BCE to the last native speakers of its final descendant, Coptic, whose displacement by Arabic following the Arab conquest of the 7th century CE was never quite complete, the liturgical use of Coptic in the Egyptian Christian Church maintaining its presence in the human voice to the present day, is the longest continuously documented language in human history. It's approximately 5,000 years of textual record, spanning a range of linguistic change that is, in the technical terms of historical linguistics, broadly comparable to the changes that have transformed Latin into the modern Romance languages over roughly the same period. The earliest Egyptian, preserved in the Old Kingdom pyramid texts and administrative documents, is a language of considerable grammatical complexity, whose verb-subject-object-word order, its system of grammatical gender, and its rich morphology of verbal suffixes and prefixes place it within the Afroasiatic language family alongside Semitic, Berber, and Cushitic. A linguistic relationship that connects ancient Egyptian to modern Arabic and Hebrew through the shared ancestry of a proto-language spoken on the African continent thousands of years before the pharaonic civilization came into existence. The language evolved significantly across its documented history through the Middle Egyptian of the classical literary tradition, which remained the standard literary and religious language long after it had ceased to be spoken as a vernacular, in the same way that Latin remained the language of European scholarship and liturgy for 1,000 years after the fall of Rome. Through the late Egyptian of the New Kingdom administrative documents, whose grammatical simplifications and vocabulary shifts track the changes of the spoken vernacular, through the Demotic of the late period, and finally into the Coptic that the early Christian community of Egypt used to translate the Bible, and whose 24 Greek letters supplemented by 6 signs from the Demotic tradition created the first complete phonetic alphabet for the Egyptian language, allowing modern linguists to reconstruct, For the first time, something of the actual sound of a tongue that the hieroglyphic script, with its consonantal notation unadorned by vowel signs, had always only partially transcribed. Fact 58. The Temple of Luxor, where the god was born. The Temple of Luxor, standing on the east bank of the Nile at the heart of the modern city of Luxor, connected in antiquity to the great temple complex of Karnak 3 kilometers to the north by the Avenue of Sphinxes, whose restoration in recent years has recreated one of the most dramatic processional routes in the history of architecture, was dedicated to the celebration of the divine birth of the pharaoh and to the festival of Opet. The annual New Kingdom ceremony, in which the divine statue of Ammon was carried in his sacred bark from Karnak to Luxor and back, the god's temporary residence in his southern sanctuary, the Opet, understood as the occasion of the renewal of the divine power that animated the royal office and through it the entire cosmic order. The construction of the temple was begun by the 18th dynasty pharaoh Amenhotep III, whose reign from approximately 1388 to 1351 BCE was one of the most prosperous in Egyptian history. Its particular combination of diplomatic skill, architectural patronage, and the accumulated wealth of the New Kingdom Empire, making it the moment at which Egyptian civilization achieved perhaps its most refined and most self-confident expression. The colonnaded court of Amenhotep III at the southern end of the temple, with its 14-meter columns topped by the open papyrus capitals that are the defining element of the Egyptian architectural vocabulary, is the most beautiful surviving example of Egyptian columnar architecture in the world. The temple was extended northward by Ramesses II, who added the great pylon entrance flanked by 6 colossal statues of himself, and originally by 2 obelisks, one of which still stands before the pylon, the other having been transported to Paris in 1833 and erected in the Place de la Concorde where it still stands today. The extraordinary later history of the temple reveals the palimpsest quality of Egyptian sacred space. A Roman legion built its headquarters inside the temple precinct in the 3rd century CE. A Christian church was constructed within the forecourt in the 4th century, and a mosque dedicated to the local holy man Abu el-Haggag was built on top of the buried forecourt in the 13th century and still stands there today, its minaret rising above the ancient columns in a juxtaposition that, far from being incongruous, embodies 3,000 years of the human impulse to mark the same ground as sacred. Fact 59. Egypt and the Bible, the intersection of 2 traditions. The relationship between ancient Egypt and the tradition preserved in the Hebrew Bible, the complex of historical encounters, cultural exchanges, and theological borrowings that connected the civilization of the Nile with the civilization of ancient Israel across the 15 centuries of their geographical proximity and their recurrent political and cultural interaction, is one of the most contested and the most consequential questions in the study of the ancient Near East, generating debates that have occupied biblical scholars, archaeologists, and Egyptologists since the beginning of serious engagement between the 2 disciplines in the 19th century. The most famous point of intersection is the Exodus narrative, the biblical account of the enslavement of the Israelites in Egypt, their liberation under the leadership of Moses through a series of divine plagues, and their departure from Egypt in the direction of the Promised Land, whose relationship to the historical record of ancient Egypt has been the subject of intensive archaeological investigation, whose results are, to put it carefully, ambiguous. There is no Egyptian documentary evidence for the presence of a group of enslaved Israelites, no record of the plagues, and no account of the departure of a large population from the Delta. Gaps in the record that the Egyptian tradition's systematic omission of military defeats and domestic catastrophes from the official record makes difficult to interpret as definitive negative evidence. The Egyptian presence in the biblical narrative extends far beyond the Exodus, however. Egypt appears throughout the Hebrew Bible as the most powerful and the most ambivalent of Israel's neighbors, the place of slavery and liberation, but also the place of refuge in time of famine, the sophisticated civilization whose influence on Israelite culture in art, literature, and wisdom tradition was pervasive and continuous. The Wisdom of Amenemop, an Egyptian wisdom text composed sometime between the 12th and 6th centuries BCE, whose particular similarity to portions of the biblical Book of Proverbs, first identified by the British scholar E. A. Wallis Budge in 1923, is sufficiently close in phrasing and in structure to constitute either direct literary borrowing or a shared dependence on a common tradition, is the clearest demonstration of the intellectual traffic between the 2 civilizations, whose products shaped both the Jewish and ultimately the Christian and Islamic traditions. Fact 60. Ancient Egypt at 60. 60 facts into the history of ancient Egypt, and the civilization has become familiar in the deepest sense. Not the remote grandeur of the monuments, but the lived warmth of the people who built them, fed themselves, sang to one another, applied their coal in the morning light, and argued before the village court about borrowed grain. We have eaten the bread and drunk the beer of the Nile Valley, followed the children to their scribble school, where they copied model texts on limestone flakes, and listened to their teacher explain why every other profession in Egypt was worse than theirs. We have heard the harp in the tomb painting and read the love poem on the ostracon, and understood that the Egyptians' famous preoccupation with death was inseparable from their equally powerful love of life. We have watched the Apis bull selected from the herds of Egypt according to its sacred markings and installed in its luxurious stabling beside the Temple of Ptah, and understood that the gods, for the Egyptians, did not inhabit a remote heaven, but walked among them in the bodies of creatures whose particular beauty made the divine immediately and tangibly present. We have followed the language of the Nile from the earliest pyramid texts to the Coptic liturgy still chanted in the Egyptian Christian church today, and recognized that the longest documented language in human history is not dead but sleeping. Its descendants still alive in the prayers of a community whose faith would have been incomprehensible to the priests of Ammon, but whose linguistic DNA traces an unbroken line to the voices of the Old Kingdom. We have stood in the Temple of Luxor and felt the accumulated weight of 3,000 years of sacred use pressing down through the Roman fortress and the Christian church and the medieval mosque into the stone that Amenhotep III laid on the riverbank when Egypt was at the height of its power. 40 facts remain. The story turns now toward the deeper mysteries, the science, the legacy, and the enduring questions that the last continent of the human mind still holds. Rest now. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 61. Ma'at, the principle that held Egypt together. Ma'at, the ancient Egyptian concept, whose translation as truth, justice, or cosmic order captures something of its meaning but none of its full weight, a word that was simultaneously the name of a goddess, the description of a physical and moral condition, the standard against which every human action was measured, and the foundational principle whose maintenance the pharaoh's primary obligation was to ensure, was the single most important concept in the entire Egyptian intellectual and religious tradition. The thread that connected the daily rituals of the temple to the political philosophy of the state, to the moral expectations placed on every individual Egyptian from the pharaoh to the most anonymous agricultural laborer in the most remote village of the Delta. The goddess Ma'at was depicted as a woman wearing on her head a single ostrich feather, the feather that served as the counterweight on the scale of judgment in the Hall of Two Truths, whose lightness was the physical expression of the quality she personified. The right relationship between all things, the condition of the universe operating as it was created to operate, without excess or deficiency, without injustice or disorder, in the precise balance that the Egyptian imagination understood as both the original state of creation and the goal toward which all human and divine effort was directed. The political implications of Ma'at were direct and demanding. The pharaoh's primary function was not the accumulation of power or the glorification of his own person, but the maintenance of Ma'at throughout the two lands, the ensuring of just administration, the protection of the weak from the strong, the regulation of the flood and the harvest, and the performance of the temple rituals whose correct enactment maintained the divine order on which the human order depended. The instructions texts of the Egyptian wisdom tradition, the literary genre in which a senior official or a king addressed moral and practical guidance to his son and successor, are filled with the language of Ma'at, their particular combination of practical advice and ethical principle, reflecting a tradition in which the good administrator and the morally good person were understood as the same individual, whose competence in the management of affairs and whose commitment to honest and just dealing were not separate qualities, but two aspects of the single virtue that Ma'at demanded of everyone who held authority over others. Fact 62. Alexander the Great in Egypt, the conqueror who became a pharaoh. The conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE, accomplished without significant military resistance. The Persian garrison of the country, surrendering to the Macedonian army at Pelusium on the delta's eastern edge, and the Persian satrap capitulating at Memphis in a campaign that lasted weeks rather than months, was the most consequential single political event in the entire 3,000-year history of Egyptian civilization, its consequences extending far beyond the replacement of one foreign ruling class with another to encompass the fundamental transformation of Egypt's cultural identity, its economic integration into the Mediterranean world system, and its eventual role as the most important single theatre in the religious and intellectual history of the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Alexander's approach to Egypt was a calculated masterpiece of political theatre. Rather than presenting himself as a foreign conqueror, the role the Persians had played with a heavy-handedness that had made them deeply unpopular with the Egyptian priesthood. He presented himself as a liberator returning Egypt to its proper divine order, offering sacrifice to the Egyptian gods, visiting the sacred Apis bull at Memphis with visible reverence, and performing the rituals of the pharaonic coronation with a seriousness that the Egyptian priests, whatever their private reservations about the Macedonian newcomer, found sufficiently convincing to validate with the theological endorsement that the new ruler required. The journey that Alexander undertook through the western desert to the Oracle of Ammon at the Siwa Oasis, a journey of 500 kilometers through terrain that the ancient sources describe as dangerously inhospitable, undertaken in the winter of 331 BCE for reasons that Alexander never publicly disclosed, resulted in the oracle's declaration that Alexander was the son of Ammon. A claim whose Egyptian theological implications made him the legitimate heir to the pharaonic tradition, and whose Greek interpretation made him the son of Zeus Ammon, divine in the Hellenic sense as well. Alexander left Egypt after only a few months, having founded the city of Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, before departing for the campaigns in Persia, Bactria, and India that would occupy the remaining 8 years of his life. He never returned to Egypt, but the city he founded on the delta's western edge would become, within a generation of his death, the most important city in the Mediterranean world and the center of the most remarkable cultural synthesis the ancient world produced. Fact 63. The Library of Alexandria, the ancient world's greatest mind. The Library of Alexandria, founded in the early 3rd century BCE under the patronage of the first two Ptolemaic rulers, Ptolemy I Soter and Ptolemy II Philadelphus, as the intellectual centerpiece of the Mausian, the research institution attached to the royal palace of Alexandria, whose name, meaning place of the Muses, is the direct ancestor of the modern word museum, was the most ambitious institutional expression of the ancient world's aspiration toward comprehensive knowledge. Its collection of papyrus scrolls at its height, estimated by ancient sources at between 400,000 and 700,000 volumes, containing works in Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Persian, and other languages gathered from every corner of the known world by agents dispatched to purchase, borrow, or confiscate any text that came to their attention. The library reportedly requiring all ships entering the harbor of Alexandria to surrender any books on board for copying before their return to their owners. The scholars who worked at the Library of Alexandria, whose names include Euclid, who wrote the Elements of Geometry, whose axiomatic method would define mathematical reasoning for the next 2,000 years. Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy using the difference in shadow lengths at Alexandria and Aswan on the summer solstice. Archimedes, who spent time at the library before returning to Syracuse. And the physician hero Philos, who performed the first systematic human dissections in the history of medicine and whose discoveries about the nervous system, the cardiovascular system, and the reproductive organs were the foundation of ancient anatomical knowledge, represent the most concentrated gathering of intellectual talent in the history of the ancient world, a community whose collective achievements in mathematics, astronomy, geography, medicine, literary scholarship, and philosophy constituted the primary intellectual legacy that the Islamic scholars of the Golden Age would preserve and extend in the 9th and 10th centuries CE. The destruction of the library, which the popular imagination assigns to a single dramatic conflagration variously attributed to Julius Caesar, the Caliph Omar, or the Christian bishop Theophilus, but which the historical evidence suggests was a gradual process of neglect and partial destruction, spread across several centuries rather than a single catastrophic event, represents the most evocative loss in the entire history of human knowledge. Its missing volumes haunting the history of science and philosophy with the perpetual question of what the subsequent development of human thought might have been had they survived. Fact 64. Cats in ancient Egypt, the sacred companion. The cat, whose domestication in Egypt is documented from approximately 4000 BCE, making it among the earliest domesticated animals in the history of human civilization, and whose elevation from the practical role of granary pest controller to the status of sacred animal, associated with the goddess Bastet, represents one of the most culturally specific developments in the entire history of the human relationship with the animal world. Occupied a place in ancient Egyptian society and Egyptian religious imagination that no other civilization has assigned to a single domestic animal. Its particular combination of practical utility, physical beauty, nocturnal mystery, and the fierce maternal protectiveness that the Egyptians associated with the divine feminine, making it the most beloved and the most theologically resonant of the Egyptian companion animals. The goddess Bastet, depicted in her fully feline form as a seated cat, or in her composite form as a woman with a cat's head, associated in her earliest manifestations with the ferocious lioness aspect of solar divinity, before her gradual transformation into the gentle, domestic, music-loving goddess of the late period, was among the most popular deities in the Egyptian pantheon from the New Kingdom onward, her cult center at Bubastes in the Delta attracting, according to Herodotus, the largest annual festival gathering in Egypt, whose particular combination of river travel, music, dancing, wine consumption, and religious observance he describes in terms that suggest something very close to a modern music festival. The killing of a cat in ancient Egypt, even accidentally, was a capital offense whose strict enforcement is attested in multiple ancient sources. And when a household cat died of natural causes, the members of the family shaved off their eyebrows as a sign of mourning, and had the animal mummified and buried in the sacred cat cemetery at Bubastes, whose excavation in the 19th century revealed hundreds of thousands of cat mummies in bronze and linen-wrapped form, accompanied by small bronze bastet figurines and tiny clay dishes that had contained offerings of food and milk. The Egyptian cat's subsequent global dispersal, from the Nile Valley along the Mediterranean trade routes to the rest of the ancient world, means that every domestic cat alive today carries, in its particular combination of independence, affection, and inexplicable dignity, a trace of the quality that made the Egyptians look at these animals and see a god. Fact 65. The Pyramid Texts, the oldest religious literature. The Pyramid Texts, the collection of religious spells, hymns, prayers, and ritual instructions, inscribed in vertical columns of hieroglyphic text on the interior walls of the burial chambers and antechambers of the pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasty pharaohs at Saqqara, beginning with the Pyramid of the Pharaoh Unas in approximately 2375 BCE, and continued in the pyramids of 5 subsequent rulers and their queens, are the oldest substantial body of religious literature in the history of humanity, their age exceeding that of the Rigveda, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and every other surviving ancient religious text by several centuries, and representing, in the most direct possible sense, the beginning of the written religious tradition. The texts were not composed for the pyramid inscriptions, but compiled from an oral and textual tradition of unknown antiquity, their internal contradictions, their multiple cosmological frameworks, and their preservation of archaic grammatical forms, whose usage had already become obsolete by the time of their inscription, suggesting that some of the material they contain may be considerably older than the Old Kingdom context in which it was written down. The purpose of the pyramid texts was entirely practical in the Egyptian sense: to ensure the successful transformation of the dead pharaoh from his earthly state into the fully realized divine form, the Ak, the transfigured spirit, that was the goal of the royal funerary program, providing him with the magical power to ascend to the heavens, to join the circumpolar stars that the Egyptians called the imperishable ones, to travel with the sun god Ra in his solar bark across the sky and through the underworld, and to take his place among the gods as an equal rather than a supplicant. The pyramid texts were the exclusive prerogative of the royal dead in the Old Kingdom. Their democratization, their adoption for the non-royal elite in the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom, and their further transformation into the Book of the Dead of the New Kingdom, tracing the gradual extension of the afterlife beliefs that had originally been reserved for the pharaoh alone to the wider population of Egyptians who could afford the materials and the scribal labor required to furnish their dead with the words of power that the royal tradition had previously monopolized. Fact 66. Egyptian games and sports, playing on the Nile. The leisure activities and competitive games of ancient Egypt, documented in the tomb paintings that show wrestling matches and stick-fighting competitions, in the discovery of game boards in tombs and settlement sites, in the literary references to hunting and fishing as the pastimes of the elite, and in the relief carvings of New Kingdom temples that show athletic competitions among the royal guard and the military, reveal a civilization whose engagement with physical competition, games of chance and strategy, and the pleasures of outdoor sport was at least as enthusiastic as its engagement with the more solemn activities that the monumental tradition records. Senet, the most popular board game in ancient Egypt, played on a grid of 30 squares arranged in 3 rows of 10, whose pieces moved according to the throw of casting sticks or knucklebones in a race whose object was to move all pieces off the board, attested from the pre-dynastic period and found in tombs from the most modest to the most royal, the game discovered in Tutankhamun's tomb being among the most elaborately made objects in the entire collection, was not merely entertainment, but a game whose symbolic resonance with the journey of the soul through the underworld gave it a religious dimension that the Egyptians explicitly recognized. Some of the illustrated papyri of the Book of the Dead showing the deceased playing Senet against an unseen opponent in a game whose outcome represents the deceased's successful navigation of the afterlife. Wrestling was the most prestigious competitive physical activity in Egyptian culture, depicted in the extraordinary detail of the Middle Kingdom tomb paintings at Beni Hassan, where approximately 400 pairs of wrestling figures demonstrate a repertoire of holds, throws, and takedowns, whose variety and whose technical specificity reveal a developed martial tradition, whose formal rules and competitive context match the wrestling traditions of later classical civilizations. Hunting, the pursuit of lions, wild bulls, ostriches, and crocodiles in the desert and the marshes, was the royal sport par excellence, its particular combination of physical danger and the demonstration of royal power over the wild and the untamed, making it the ideological equivalent of military victory over human enemies. And the pharaoh's depiction as the hunter of wild beasts was as charged with theological significance as his depiction as the smiter of foreign peoples. Fact 67. The Ptolemaic Kingdom, when Egypt became Greek. The Ptolemaic Kingdom, the dynasty founded by Ptolemy Isoter, the Macedonian general who secured Egypt in the Wars of Succession, following Alexander the Great's death in 323 BCE, and who declared himself pharaoh in 305 BCE, ruling Egypt and its empire until the death of Cleopatra VII in 30 BCE, was not, despite its Greek ruling class, its Greek administrative language. And its self-conscious positioning as a Hellenistic monarchy in the tradition of Alexander's successors, simply a Greek state transplanted to the banks of the Nile, but a genuinely hybrid civilization, whose particular synthesis of Greek and Egyptian, cultural, religious, and administrative traditions produced some of the most remarkable intellectual and artistic achievements of the ancient world, and whose particular form of multicultural governance. Maintaining Egyptian religious institutions with generous patronage, while conducting diplomacy and high administration in Greek, constitutes the most sophisticated experiment in the management of cultural diversity that the ancient world produced. The Ptolemaic rulers' patronage of Egyptian religion was not mere political calculation, though it was certainly that. The rulers who built the temples of Horus at Edfu, Sobek at Kom-Ombo, and Isis at Philae, whose lavishly carved walls preserve the most complete surviving record of the Egyptian religious tradition in its final flowering, were investing in the ideological legitimacy that the endorsement of the Egyptian priesthood provided for a foreign dynasty, whose claim to the double crown rested on the same theological foundations as that of every native pharaoh before them. The cultural synthesis that Alexandria embodied, the city in which the Jewish scholars translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek to produce the Septuagint, in which the Egyptian priest Manetho compiled the king lists, whose dynastic framework Egyptologists still use today, in which Euclid systematized geometry and Eratosthenes measured the earth, was the most productive encounter between different intellectual traditions in the history of the ancient world. Its particular legacy, the transmission of Egyptian and Near Eastern knowledge into the Greek philosophical framework that would carry it into the European tradition. Fact 68. Egyptian funerary architecture, from mastaba to pyramid. The evolution of Egyptian funerary architecture, the progression from the simple pit grave of the pre-dynastic period through the mud brick mastabas of the early dynastic period to the stepped pyramid of Djoser and the true pyramids of the 4th dynasty, followed by the rock-cut tombs of the Middle and New Kingdom nobility, and ultimately the underground valleys of the pharaonic necropolis, traces not merely the development of an architectural tradition, but the progressive elaboration of a theological vision, whose physical form was the direct expression of the evolving Egyptian understanding of what the dead required for the successful completion of their journey to eternal life. The mastaba, the flat-topped rectangular superstructure of mud brick or stone that marked the grave of the early dynastic elite, and gave the later Old Kingdom nobility their primary burial form, its name deriving from the Arabic word for bench from its resemblance to the low platforms on which Egyptian laborers sat, was not merely a grave marker, but a functional building, whose particular combination of a sealed burial shaft beneath the floor protecting the mummified body and its funerary equipment, and a decorated offering chapel in the upper structure, providing the physical space in which the funerary cult could be maintained, and the car of the deceased could receive the food and drink offerings on which its continued existence depended. Encoded in architecture, the entire theological program of the Egyptian afterlife. The transition from the mastaba to the pyramid was accomplished in a single reign, that of Djoser in the 3rd dynasty, through the architectural genius of Imhotep, who began with the conventional mastaba form and added one step tier after another until the final structure of 6 diminishing mastabas, stacked vertically, created a form whose visual dynamics, the upward thrust, the relationship to the sky, the visibility from the surrounding desert, expressed a theology of solar ascension that the horizontal mastaba could not achieve. The subsequent development from the step to the true pyramid, through the bent pyramid's course correction midway through construction, and the red pyramid's first successful smooth-sided form, was accomplished within the reign of a single pharaoh, Sneferu, whose 3 pyramids represent the most intensive period of architectural experimentation in the history of construction, and whose collective stone volume exceeds that of his son Khufu's Great Pyramid. Fact 69, Egypt under Roman rule, the last chapter. The Roman province of Egyptus, established following the suicide of Cleopatra VII and the annexation of the Ptolemaic kingdom by the Emperor Augustus in 30 BCE. Governed for the next 7 centuries by a series of Roman and then Byzantine prefects and emperors, whose relationship with the ancient Egyptian religious tradition evolved from the respectful distance of the early imperial period through the active persecution of the Diocletianic era to the systematic dismantling of the pagan temples and the installation of Christian bishops that characterized the 4th and 5th centuries CE. Was the richest and the most strategically important province in the entire Roman Empire, its agricultural surplus feeding the city of Rome, and its grain fleet the most consequential single logistical operation in the Roman imperial system. The early Roman emperors adopted toward the Egyptian religious tradition a posture that closely resembled that of the Ptolemies, presenting themselves in the temple reliefs as pharaohs in the Egyptian style, making offerings to the Egyptian gods, and providing the financial support for the completion of temple building projects whose most impressive surviving products, the temples at Dendera, Edfu, and Philae, were largely finished under Roman imperial patronage. The spread of Christianity in Egypt, where the tradition holds that the gospel was brought to Alexandria by the evangelist Mark in the 1st century CE, and where the combination of the Egyptian tradition of intense personal piety, the philosophical sophistication of the Alexandrian intellectual community, and the particular resonance between the Osiris resurrection mythology and the Christian narrative of death and rebirth, created an extraordinarily fertile environment for the new faith, transformed the religious landscape of the province within 3 centuries of the crucifixion, the Coptic Church that emerged from this tradition developing its own theological character, its own liturgical language, and its own monastic tradition, whose influence on the subsequent development of Christian monasticism throughout the world was profound. The closure of the last Egyptian pagan temple, the Temple of Isis at Philae, whose final hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE, and whose last demotic inscription dates to 452 CE, marked the end of the world's longest continuous religious tradition, the final silence of the gods whose names had been spoken on the banks of the Nile for more than 3,000 years. Fact 70, Ancient Egypt at 70. 70 facts into the history of ancient Egypt, and the civilization has given us everything. Its gods and its grammar, its bread and its beer, its children at their scribal tablets, its cats watching the darkness, its priests smoothing the sanctuary floor, and now the long twilight of Roman rule in which the old gods gave way, slowly and with great dignity, to the new faith whose monks would carry into the European Middle Ages so many of the contemplative practices that the Egyptian desert had first developed. We have sat with Ma'at and understood that the feather she wears is not a decoration, but a standard, the measure against which every human life is weighed, and the principle whose maintenance was the first obligation of every person who held authority over another. We have followed Alexander through the desert to the Oracle of Siwa and watched him become a pharaoh in the traditional form, understanding that the greatest conqueror of the ancient world recognized in the Egyptian royal theology a legitimating power that his own Macedonian tradition could not provide. We have stood in the library of Alexandria and felt the particular quality of a loss that can never be repaired, the scrolls that burned or rotted or were simply never copied containing the mathematics and the medicine and the philosophy of a world that might have changed everything we subsequently became. We have held the cats of Bubastes and heard the harp at the Ptolemaic banquet and watched the last hieroglyph carved at Philae, knowing that the hand that carved it was the last in a tradition that stretched back 4,000 years. We have stood in the temple of Isis as the final lamps were extinguished and the priests dispersed, and the silence settled over the stone that had known their voices for 100 generations. 30 facts remain. The story turns now toward the legacy, toward what ancient Egypt gave to the world that came after it, and what the world that came after is still discovering. Rest now in this ancient quiet. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 71, Egyptian glass and faience, the first industrial chemistry. The Egyptian traditions of glass and faience production, the two related technologies through which the Egyptians manufactured the brilliant blue-green artificial materials whose color vocabulary, evoking simultaneously the sky, the Nile, the fertile vegetation of the flood plain, and the sacred turquoise of the Sinai mines, was the most theologically charged in the entire Egyptian visual system, represent the earliest examples in human history of large-scale industrial chemistry. The deliberate manipulation of raw materials through controlled high-temperature processes to produce new substances with predetermined physical and optical properties, a technological achievement whose difficulty should not be underestimated, given that it was accomplished without the benefit of thermometers, written chemical formulas, or any of the other tools that modern materials science takes as its starting point. Faience, the glazed non-clay ceramic material, made from a core of ground quartz or sand bonded with small amounts of lime and either natron or plant ash, coated with a glaze whose blue-green color was produced by the copper compounds dissolved in the glassy surface layer, was one of the most ubiquitous materials of Egyptian material culture, produced in enormous quantities for the manufacture of amulets, beads, shabtis, tiles, vessels, and the decorative inlays of jewelry and furniture across the entire span of Egyptian civilization from the pre-dynastic period to the Roman era. Its particular combination of relative cheapness, durability, and the brilliant color that the Egyptians associated with fertility, regeneration, and divine protection, making it the democratic version of the turquoise and lapis lazuli, whose import from distant mines was available only to the wealthiest members of Egyptian society. True glass, produced by heating quartz sand, natron, and lime to temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Celsius, in a process whose control required a degree of technological sophistication that the Egyptians do not appear to have achieved before the New Kingdom period. The earliest Egyptian glass objects dating to approximately 1500 BCE was treated in its early centuries as an artificial gemstone. Its production reserved for the royal workshops, and its products distributed as prestige objects among the elite, and as diplomatic gifts to the rulers of the Near Eastern kingdoms, with whom Egypt maintained the complex exchange relationships of the Bronze Age international system. The glass vessels of the 18th dynasty, the small core-formed bottles and vases whose swirled decoration in blue, white, yellow, and green was achieved by trailing threads of molten-colored glass around a sand core and combing the still soft surface with a pointed tool, are among the most technically accomplished and the most visually beautiful objects in the entire Egyptian artistic tradition. Fact 72. The Amarna Letters, Egypt's Bronze Age diplomacy. The Amarna Letters, the archive of diplomatic correspondence, discovered at the site of Akhenaten's capital city Amarna in 1887, consisting of approximately 380 cuneiform clay tablets recording the official communications between the Egyptian court and the rulers of the great powers and vassal states of the ancient Near East during the reigns of Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, and possibly Tutankhamun and his immediate successors. The correspondence, written primarily in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the Bronze Age, constitute the most important single archive of international diplomacy in the history of the ancient world, their preservation the result of the peculiar historical accident that the tablets were stored in the office of the Royal Archive at Amarna at the time of the city's abandonment, buried under the rubble of the demolished buildings, and remained undisturbed until a local woman digging for fertilizer broke the first tablet with her mattock and initiated the series of sales through the antiquities market that eventually brought the archive to the attention of the scholarly world. The picture of Bronze Age international relations that the archive reveals is one of extraordinary sophistication and surprisingly recognizable diplomatic conventions. The great powers Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and Hatti addressed one another as brothers, bound by a code of gift exchange, diplomatic marriage, and mutual acknowledgement, whose maintenance was the primary business of the royal courts and whose disruption, through the failure to send the expected gifts, the imprisonment of royal messengers, or the refusal to honor treaty commitment, was treated with the same gravity that modern nations attach to the violation of international law. The letters from the Canaanite vassal princes, the smaller portion of the archive, but in some ways the most vivid, depict a world of constant internecine conflict, of local rulers appealing desperately to the pharaoh for military assistance against their neighbors, of Egyptian officials accused of corruption and partiality, and of the gradual erosion of Egyptian authority in the Levant during the distracted reign of Akhenaten, whose preoccupation with his religious revolution at home left the administration of the empire in the hands of officials whose responsiveness to the increasingly urgent requests of the vassal rulers the archive reveals to have been inadequate to the situation they confronted. Fact 73. Egyptian magic, the power behind the ritual. Egyptian magic, the tradition of practical supernatural intervention in the affairs of the natural world whose practitioners, the Heka specialists, operated at every level of Egyptian society from the royal court to the village household, using spells, amulets, ritual actions, and the manipulation of symbolic objects to achieve outcomes that ranged from the healing of disease and the protection of the vulnerable to the cursing of enemies and the manipulation of the forces that governed fertility. Weather and the movements of the celestial bodies was not, in the Egyptian understanding, a separate or inferior category of religious practice distinguishable from legitimate religion by its manipulative intention, but a dimension of the same sacred power, Heka, that the gods themselves wielded in the maintenance of the cosmic order, and that human beings could access through the correct combination of knowledge, ritual purity, and the proper use of the potent materials, certain plants, minerals, animal parts, and above all words, through which the power of Heka was concentrated and directed. The word itself, Heka, was personified as a god, the god Heka, depicted as a man holding two entwined serpents, who was understood to have existed before the creation, and whose power the sun god Ra used in the act of creating the universe. A personification whose theological implication was that magic was not a human addition to the divine order, but its foundation. The force through which the gods maintained the world, and through whose proper use human beings could participate in that maintenance. The practical applications of Egyptian magic ranged from the utterly routine, the amuletic jewelry worn daily against illness and misfortune, the spells recited at childbirth to protect the mother and the newborn, the protective formulas applied to the doorways of houses to prevent the entry of hostile supernatural forces, to the highly specialized. The execration texts, in which the names of foreign enemies and domestic criminals were written on clay figurines or pottery bowls that were then ritually smashed to neutralize the threat they represented. The love spells, whose particular combination of invocation, sympathetic magic, and verbal compulsion survive in sufficient numbers to suggest a robust popular market for the services of the specialists who provided them. And the elaborate mortuary magic of the funerary texts, whose spells equipped the dead with powers that the living could only aspire to, making the boundary between the magic of the living and the magic of the dead one of degree rather than of kind. Fact 74, the conquest of Nubia, Egypt's empire to the south. The relationship between ancient Egypt and Nubia, the territory stretching southward from the first Nile cataract at Aswan deep into the modern Sudan, whose successive cultures, known to Egyptologists by the archaeological designations A Group, C Group, Kerma, Napatan, and Merowitic, constituted for the entire span of Egyptian civilization simultaneously a trading partner, a military adversary, a source of the gold and luxury goods that sustained Egyptian wealth. And a rival civilization whose cultural sophistication and whose periodic political power rivaled, and on one occasion exceeded that of Egypt itself, was the most sustained and the most consequential bilateral relationship in the history of the ancient Nile Valley, its 3,000-year arc encompassing Egyptian conquest and Nubian resistance, Egyptian cultural influence and Nubian cultural absorption and transformation. And the extraordinary reversal of the 25th dynasty, in which the roles of colonizer and colonized were definitively inverted. The Egyptian presence in Nubia began with the Old Kingdom expeditions that established trading relationships with the A Group culture of Lower Nubia, whose gold, ebony, ivory, and aromatic resins the Egyptian state required in quantities that voluntary exchange could not always supply, and escalated through the Middle Kingdom's construction of a chain of massive mud brick fortresses at the Second Nile Cataract, Buhen, Mergissa, Semna, and Qumma among them, whose defensive perimeters, garrison accommodations, and elaborate systems of communication and supply represent the most sophisticated military engineering project in the ancient world before the Roman limes. The New Kingdom's systematic colonization of Nubia following the expulsion of the Hyksos transformed the region from a contested frontier zone into an integral part of the Egyptian empire. The construction of temples at Abu Simbel, Soleb, and Sesibai, announcing the permanent presence of the pharaonic state in territories that the Middle Kingdom had merely controlled. The appointment of the Viceroy of Kush as the administrative head of the Nubian provinces, creating the institutional framework through which the annual tribute of gold, cattle, grain, and captives that made Nubia indispensable to the Egyptian imperial economy was extracted and delivered to the royal treasuries at Thebes and Memphis. Fact 75, papyrus, the technology that gave Egypt its voice. Papyrus, the writing material manufactured from the triangular-stemmed aquatic plant Cyprus papyrus, that grew in dense stands along the margins of the Nile and in the marshes of the delta, whose processing into a durable, lightweight, and relatively inexpensive writing surface gave the Egyptian scribal tradition the material foundation for the enormous documentary output that is the primary source of our knowledge of ancient Egyptian civilization. Was the most consequential single technological development in the history of ancient Egyptian literacy, the innovation that made possible the expansion of the written word from the stone walls of temples and tombs into the portable, reproducible, and flexible medium, without which the management of a complex administrative civilization would have been impossible. The production process, in which the green stems of the papyrus plant were cut into lengths, the outer rind removed, the inner pith sliced into thin strips, the strips laid side by side in two perpendicular layers, and then beaten and pressed together until the natural sugars of the plant cemented the strips into a single unified sheet, produced a writing surface whose quality varied considerably depending on the freshness of the plant, the skill of the manufacturer, and the intended use, the finest papyrus being so smooth and so consistent in surface that the finest scribal work on it rivals the quality of the best medieval vellum. The Egyptian papyrus industry was a state monopoly whose products were exported throughout the Mediterranean world and the Near East, the word papyrus itself giving every subsequent European language its word for the writing material that the Greek and Roman civilizations adopted from Egypt and that eventually evolved through the Arabic and medieval European traditions into the paper whose own name preserves the memory of the Egyptian plant from which the entire tradition of portable writing material descends. The survival of papyrus documents from ancient Egypt, in the dry conditions of the desert that preserved organic materials for thousands of years, while the humid climates of Greece, Rome, and the Near East destroyed virtually all comparable documents, means that Egypt is more richly documented in terms of ordinary daily life than any other ancient civilization. The tax records, love letters, medical prescriptions, shopping lists, legal contracts, and literary compositions preserved in the desert sand, providing the most direct access available to the experience of living in the ancient world. Fact 76. The Egyptian concept of the soul, Ka, Ba, and Ak. The Egyptian understanding of the human person, whose complexity and whose internal differentiation go considerably beyond the body-soul dualism of the Western philosophical tradition, and whose multiple components, each with its own specific nature, its own specific needs, and its own specific vulnerability, required different forms of care in life and different forms of provision in death, is among the most philosophically interesting contributions of the Egyptian tradition to the history of the human understanding of consciousness, identity, and the relationship between the physical and the non-physical dimensions of personal existence. The Ka, the vital life force that was understood as the double of the living person, born simultaneously with the physical body and dependent on its continued existence or its accurate representation in statue form for its own survival after death. Nourished by the food and drink offerings placed before the false door of the tomb in the continuing funerary cult, whose maintenance by the living relatives and the professional mortuary priests was the practical expression of the Egyptian obligation to the dead, was not precisely a soul in the Western sense, but something closer to the animating principle of biological life. The specific energy whose presence distinguished the living from the dead, and whose continued existence after the body's death, required the material provisions of the funerary cult in a way that reflected the Ka's fundamentally embodied character. The Ba depicted in Egyptian art as a bird with a human head, the visual combination expressing the Ba's unique ability to move freely between the realm of the dead and the realm of the living, was the component of the person that modern translators most frequently render as soul, its particular character the individuality and the personality of the specific person whose death had separated it from the body with which it was identified. Its freedom of movement allowing it to leave the tomb during the day and visit the familiar places of the dead person's life before returning to the mummy at nightfall. The Ak, the fully realized, transfigured spiritual form of the successfully transformed dead, the luminous being whose achievement required both the correct performance of the funerary rituals and the moral worthiness demonstrated in the judgment of the heart, was the goal of the entire Egyptian funerary program, the form in which the blessed dead joined the company of the gods and participated in the eternal processes of the cosmos. Traveling with Ra in the solar bark and shining with the imperishable stars in the northern sky that the Egyptians called the imperishable ones. Fact 77. The Sea Peoples, the crisis that almost ended Egypt. Sea Peoples, the general designation used by modern scholars for the confederation of displaced peoples from the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Eastern Mediterranean, whose migrations, raids, and invasions in the decades around 1200 BCE disrupted or destroyed virtually every major civilization of the Late Bronze Age, bringing down the Hittite Empire, reducing the city-states of the Levantan coast to archaeological ruin layers, destabilizing the Mycenaean civilization of Greece, and mounting a sustained assault on Egypt, whose eventual repulsion by Ramesses II preserved Egyptian civilization from the fate that overtook its neighbors. are among the most debated and the most historically consequential groups of people in the entire history of the ancient Near East. Their identity, their origins, and the precise mechanisms of their impact on the Bronze Age world remaining the subject of active scholarly discussion, despite more than a century of sustained research. The Egyptian sources for the Sea Peoples crisis, primarily the inscriptions and reliefs of the mortuary temple of Ramesses II at Medinet Habu, which provide the most detailed account of the battles fought against the invaders on both land and sea in the 8th year of the king's reign, describe a coalition of peoples whose Egyptian names, Peliset, Tijeka, Shekelesh, Denian, and Weshesh, have been identified with varying degrees of confidence with the Philistines, the Sicels of Sicily, the Achaeans of Greece, and other peoples of the Bronze Age Aegean and Mediterranean world. The naval battle fought by Ramesses II against the Sea Peoples in the Delta, depicted in the Medinet Habu reliefs with a vividness and a tactical detail that make it the most informative single representation of ancient naval warfare to survive from the ancient world. The Egyptian archers on the deck and the shore firing into the crowded enemy vessels, while Egyptian sailors grapple the invaders' ships and pull them into killing range, ended in an Egyptian victory whose completeness was sufficient to prevent the settlement of the Sea Peoples in Egypt itself, though the Peliset, who were subsequently settled in the southern Levantine coast as Egyptian vassals, became the Philistines of the biblical tradition, their very name preserved in the modern designation Palestine. Fact 78. Egyptian wine, the drink of the gods. Wine, whose cultivation in ancient Egypt, documented from the earliest dynastic period in the vineyards of the Delta and the oases of the Western Desert, whose products were consumed at the royal court, offered to the gods in the temple rituals, and placed in the tombs of the elite as the most prestigious of the funerary food offerings, occupied in the Egyptian social and religious hierarchy, a position clearly distinct from the beer that was the democratic beverage of the entire population. Its relative scarcity, its association with the Delta's Greek and Levantine trading connections, and its particular role in the ritual life of the Hathor cult making it simultaneously a luxury, a religious substance, and a diplomatic commodity whose quality and provenance the surviving wine jar labels of the New Kingdom record with a specificity that rivals the appellations of a modern wine region. The Egyptian wine industry of the New Kingdom period, whose primary production centers in the Western Delta, particularly at the sites of Peramus and the vineyards of the Nile Delta region, supplied the royal cellars, the temple estates, and the funerary provision of the wealthy, kept records of vintage, origin, and quality on the clay ceilings of the wine jars whose inscriptions, describing the wine as good, sweet, twice good, or the more diplomatically ambiguous very, very good, provide the earliest surviving wine quality assessments in the history of viticulture. The religious significance of wine in the Egyptian tradition was concentrated in the cult of Hathor, the goddess of love, beauty, music, and fertility, whose particular association with the intoxicating substances that dissolved the ordinary boundaries of consciousness, including both wine and the psychoactive blue lotus that the Egyptians cultivated in their ornamental pools, reflected the Egyptian understanding of ecstatic experience as one of the primary modalities of divine encounter, whose festivals were accompanied by the communal consumption of wine in quantities sufficient to produce the collective, altered state that the theology of the occasion required. The tomb paintings of the New Kingdom nobility show vineyards trained on wooden trellises, the harvest in progress, the grapes being trodden in wooden vats by workers who steadied themselves on ropes strung above, the juice running into large pottery vessels for fermentation, agricultural scenes whose domesticity and whose sensory vividness convey, across 3,000 years, the particular pleasures of the Egyptian autumn. Fact 79. The afterlife of ancient Egypt, how a civilization shaped the world. The legacy of ancient Egypt in the subsequent history of world civilization, the network of intellectual, artistic, religious, and technological influences through which the 3,000-year achievement of the Nile Valley civilization shaped the Greek, Roman, Jewish, Christian, Islamic, and ultimately the modern world in ways whose full extent is still being mapped by historians, is at once broader and deeper than the popular understanding of Egypt as a civilization of picturesque monuments and exotic religion suggests. Its particular contributions to the subsequent development of human thought touching dimensions of culture as different as the design of the alphabet, the theology of the resurrection, the conventions of monumental architectural space, and the mathematical foundations of Greek geometry. The influence of Egypt on ancient Greece, the civilization through whose particular synthesis of Egyptian, Near Eastern, and native Greek elements, the primary intellectual tradition of Western civilization was formed, was pervasive and continuous. Greek intellectuals from Herodotus to Plato to Pythagoras either visited Egypt or reported the Egyptian origin of the knowledge they transmitted. the Egyptian astronomical and mathematical tradition, providing the empirical foundation on which the deductive structure of Greek mathematics was built, the Egyptian medical tradition of the Edwin Smith Papyrus, and the Ebers Papyrus informing the Hippocratic tradition's emphasis on systematic clinical observation, and the Egyptian religious tradition. Particularly the Osiris mythology, with its narrative of death, divine judgment, and resurrection, providing the theological vocabulary through which the early Christian community expressed its understanding of the death and resurrection of Jesus. The discovery of ancient Egypt by the modern world, initiated by Napoleon's Egyptian campaign of 1798, whose scientific team produced the Description de l'Egypte, the most comprehensive documentation of a non-Western civilization that European scholarship had yet produced, and accelerated by Champollion's decipherment of the hieroglyphic script in 1822. Inaugurated the Egyptomania that swept European and American culture in the 19th century, and whose influence is visible in the obelisks of the Place de la Concorde and Central Park, the Egyptian revival architecture of the early 19th century, and the persistent fascination with Egyptian themes in popular culture whose latest expressions, the Egyptological bestsellers, the documentary series, the museum blockbusters, demonstrate that the civilization of the Nile has lost none of its capacity to astonish and to compel. Fact 80, Ancient Egypt at 80. 80 facts into the history of ancient Egypt, and the civilization that began on the banks of the Nile has grown to encompass the entire ancient world. Its influence carried on the papyrus rolls of the Library of Alexandria into the Greek philosophical tradition, in the tomb paintings of the Valley of the Kings into the modern museum, in the hieroglyphs on the obelisks of Paris and New York into the urban landscape of the 21st century. We have held the brilliant blue of the faience amulet and understood that the Egyptians were chemists as well as theologians, that the color they manufactured at such technical cost was not merely beautiful but theologically necessary, the blue of the sky and the Nile concentrated in an object small enough to wear against the skin. We have read the Amarna letters and recognized in the Bronze Age diplomats their urgent requests for gold and military assistance, something utterly familiar, the anxiety of the smaller state appealing to the greater power, the frustration of the ally whose messages go unanswered. We have followed the papyrus reed from the Nile marsh to the scribal palette, and understood that without this plant, growing in the mud at the river's edge, the entire documentary record of ancient Egypt would not exist. The love poems, the medical prescriptions, the tax records, the legal disputes, the wisdom texts, all of them dependent on the specific chemistry of a specific plant in a specific river. We have felt the weight of the Egyptian soul in all its parts, the car that needed feeding, the bar that needed freedom, the act that needed to be earned, and recognized in this complex portrait of the person a seriousness about the inner life that the monumental tradition, with its eternal pharaohs and its idealized ritual scenes, does not always reveal. We have watched the sea peoples come and the Egyptians repel them, and understood that the civilization that built the Great Pyramid also produced the world's first recorded naval battle. 20 facts remain. The story turns now toward its conclusion, toward the question of what ancient Egypt ultimately was, and what it still is, and what it will always be. Rest now in the deep quiet of the ancient night. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 81, the coffin texts, democracy of the afterlife. The coffin texts, the body of approximately 1,200 religious spells and ritual instructions, painted or inscribed on the interior surfaces of the wooden coffins of the Middle Kingdom elite, between approximately 2055 and 1650 BCE. Drawn from the older pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom, but significantly expanded, modified, and reorganized to serve the needs of a broader class of dead than the exclusively royal audience for whom the original material had been composed, represent the most consequential democratization in the entire history of Egyptian religious thought. The moment at which the elaborate magical and theological technology of the afterlife, previously the exclusive preserve of the pharaoh and his immediate family, was made available to any Egyptian wealthy enough to commission a well-made coffin and the services of a skilled funerary scribe. The theological revolution that the coffin texts represent was not merely social but cosmological. The identification of the dead person with Osiris, which in the Old Kingdom texts was restricted to the pharaoh alone, the dead king becoming Osiris while his successor became Horus, was extended in the coffin texts to every deceased individual of sufficient status to afford the proper funerary preparation, each person addressed in the texts as Osiris followed by their personal name. A formulation whose theological implication was that the resurrection and the eternal life that the Osiris mythology promised were available not by divine right of royal birth, but by the correct performance of the funerary ritual, and the moral worthiness of the individual life. The physical context of the coffin texts, the inner surfaces of the rectangular wooden coffins whose four sides, two ends, lid, and floor provided the writing surface for the most important of the spells, created a specific relationship between the text and the body it surrounded. The dead person lay within a cocoon of protective words, the spells covering every visible surface of the enclosed space, creating a total magical environment, whose effect was the continuous recitation of the protective formulas around the vulnerable body, as surely as if priests had been hired to read them aloud around the clock. The coffin text tradition was the direct literary ancestor of the Book of the Dead, the New Kingdom compilation that extended the democratization of the afterlife literature still further, making the spells and their illustrated vignettes available in papyrus form to any family that could afford a scroll, and placing in the hands of every Egyptian who purchased one the same magical equipment that the Old Kingdom pharaohs had reserved for themselves alone. Fact 82. The Opet Festival, Egypt's greatest celebration. The Opet Festival, the most important religious festival in the New Kingdom Egyptian calendar, celebrated annually during the second month of the inundation season at Thebes, lasting in its longest recorded form 27 days, and involving the ceremonial procession of the divine statues of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu from their shrines in the Karnak temple complex southward along the 3-kilometer avenue of Sphinxes to the Temple of Luxor and back. Was the most spectacular public religious event in the entire Egyptian ritual year. Its combination of divine procession, royal ceremonial, musical performance, public feasting, and the symbolic renewal of the pharaoh's divine power, making it the most direct expression in the Egyptian religious calendar of the relationship between the gods, the king, and the people, whose participation in the festival was both a religious obligation and the occasion for the distribution of food and drink on a scale whose generosity was itself an expression of the divine abundance that the festival celebrated. The theological purpose of the Opet festival was the annual renewal of the Ka of the pharaoh, the vital divine force whose depletion over the course of the agricultural and political year required periodic replenishment through the direct encounter of the royal person with the divine presence concentrated in the sanctuary of the Luxor temple, the Opet, where Amun was understood to reside in his specifically generative aspect as the source of royal divine power. The procession itself, in which the divine statues, each enclosed in its naos shrine and placed aboard the gilded sacred bark whose carrying poles rested on the shoulders of the shaven-headed priests, were carried in state through the streets of Thebes, while the crowd lining the route received offerings of bread, beer, and meat from the temple stores. Musicians played on harps, lutes, drums, and sistrums. Acrobats performed. And the soldiers of the royal guard provided both ceremonial escort and crowd management. Was the moment of maximum contact between the divine and the human in the Egyptian religious year, the gods visible to the people, in a form that the daily temple ritual, conducted in the sealed darkness of the inner sanctuary, entirely prevented. The accounts kept by the temple scribes of the quantities of food distributed during the Opet festival, tens of thousands of loaves of bread, hundreds of jars of beer, entire herds of cattle, give the festival its practical as well as its theological dimension. The redistribution of the temple's agricultural surplus to the population of Thebes through the vehicle of the divine celebration was the economic mechanism through which the temple's wealth circulated back into the community that had generated it. Fact 83. Egyptian boats and the Nile, the highway of civilization. The Nile River, whose particular geography, flowing northward while the prevailing winds blow southward, created a natural two-way highway along whose entire navigable length the sailing boat could travel upstream with the wind, and the rowing boat could travel downstream with the current, a combination whose practical consequence was the effective unification of the 600-kilometer length of the Egyptian Nile Valley into a single economic and administrative space. Was the most important single factor in the maintenance of Egyptian political and economic unity across the 3,000-year span of the civilization, its particular character as a navigable river that offered no significant obstacles to the movement of goods and people between the Mediterranean coast and the first cataract at Aswan, making possible the integration of a territory whose longitudinal extent was greater than that of any other ancient state. The boats that exploited this natural highway ranged from the simple papyrus reed rafts used for local fishing and fowling in the marshes of the delta, depicted in the Old Kingdom tomb paintings with a vividness that conveys both their fragility and their agility in the shallow vegetated waters for which they were designed, to the large wooden cargo vessels that transporting the pyramid stones from their quarries to the construction sites, to the elaborate cedar-hulled barges that carried the divine statues in the great religious processions, to the ocean-going vessels that crossed the Red Sea to the land of Punt and navigated the eastern Mediterranean to the cedar ports of the Levantine coast. The solar bark in which the sun god Ra was understood to travel across the sky during the day and through the underworld during the night, whose divine reality was expressed on earth in the full-scale wooden boats buried beside the pyramids for the posthumous use of the dead pharaoh, gives the river boat its ultimate theological significance in the Egyptian imagination. The boat is not merely the primary vehicle of Egyptian commerce and administration, but the vehicle of the cosmic journey itself, the form in which the most fundamental process of the universe, the daily renewal of light, was understood to take place. The full-scale cedar boat discovered in a pit beside the Great Pyramid at Giza in 1954, whose 43 meters of disassembled planks, ropes, and oars were found sealed in their original pit after 4,500 years, is the oldest surviving full-scale vessel in the history of the world, and the most direct physical evidence of the ancient Egyptian tradition of river and maritime navigation, whose importance to the civilization that built the pyramids cannot be overstated. Fact 84: the Egyptian creation myths, how the world began. The Egyptian tradition of cosmogony, the stories through which the civilization explained the origin of the universe, the emergence of the gods, and the creation of the human world, was, in characteristic Egyptian fashion, not a single canonical narrative, but a collection of distinct and in some respects mutually incompatible creation, accounts maintained simultaneously by the different cult centers of the Egyptian religious tradition, each reflecting the particular theological preoccupations of the deity at its center, and each offering a different emphasis on the primary creative act from which all subsequent existence derived. The Heliopolitan cosmogony, the creation narrative of the sun god Ra's cult center at Heliopolis, whose particular influence on the Old Kingdom royal theology made it the most widely disseminated of the Egyptian creation accounts, described the origin of the universe as the self-creation of the primordial god Atum, who arose from the waters of Nun, the primordial chaos on the first mound of earth, and who generated the first divine couple, Shu and Tefnut, from his own body through an act of self-stimulation or spitting, whose particular theological audacity in assigning the origin of the divine order to a solitary act of the body was mitigated in the ritual context by its identification with the creative power of the divine word. The Memphite theology preserved in the so-called Shabaka stone, a late-period basalt stele in the British Museum on which the Nubian pharaoh Shabaka of the 25th dynasty had inscribed what he described as an ancient text found in a worm-eaten state, and whose content describes the creation of the world by the god Ptah of Memphis through the power of his heart, understood as the seat of thought, and his tongue, understood as the organ of the creative word, is the Egyptian cosmological text, most frequently compared to the opening of the Gospel of John, its identification of the divine word as the creative principle through which all things came into existence, anticipating by more than a millennium the theological vocabulary that the author of the fourth Gospel would deploy in the context of a very different religious tradition. The Hermopolitan cosmogony, centered on the cult of Thoth at Hermopolis, described the creation as the emergence of the sun from the primordial lotus flower that arose from the dark waters of chaos, an image of such visual immediacy and such theological poetry that it became one of the most reproduced motifs in the entire Egyptian artistic tradition, the blue lotus opening on the dark water to reveal the light that would create the world. Fact 85: Egyptian taxation, running the ancient state. The Egyptian taxation system, the administrative mechanism through which the pharaonic state extracted from the agricultural surplus of the Nile Valley the material resources required for the construction of the monuments, the maintenance of the temples, the provisioning of the army, and the support of the bureaucratic apparatus, whose collective labor constituted the operational capacity of the ancient state, was the most sophisticated and the most comprehensive system of compulsory resource extraction in the ancient world. Its particular efficiency, the product of the combination of the Egyptian state's control of the primary means of agricultural production through its ownership of the land, its development of the writing and record-keeping traditions required for the accurate assessment and tracking of tax obligations across a territory of 600 kilometers, and the ecological predictability of the Nile flood, whose annual variation in height could be measured by the Nilometers, graduated stone columns placed at intervals along the river to record the flood level, and used to adjust the tax assessment for the coming year with accuracy that no other ancient agricultural civilization could match. The primary tax was assessed on the grain harvest, with the tax rate calculated as a proportion of the expected yield, determined by the flood height and the area of land brought under cultivation. a system whose internal logic was sufficiently sophisticated to account for the variation in agricultural productivity between years of high flood, whose excessive inundation could damage as well as fertilize the fields, and years of low flood, whose insufficient inundation left portions of the cultivable land too dry for planting. The collection of the grain tax was managed by the local officials of each nome, the administrative districts into which Egypt was divided from the earliest dynastic period, whose scribes measured the standing grain in the fields before the harvest, assessed the tax obligation, and oversaw the transport of the collected grain to the state granaries, whose stocks constituted the primary reserve from which the workers, soldiers, and officials of the Egyptian state were paid in rations. The surviving tax records of ancient Egypt, the papyri and ostraka that record the assessments, the collections, the disputes, and the occasional remissions of the grain tax across the centuries of Egyptian history, provide the most detailed surviving picture of the mechanics of ancient state finance available from any ancient civilization and reveal, behind the monumental grandeur of the official record, the persistent human realities of the small farmer arguing with the tax collector about the height of the flood and the fairness of the assessment. Fact 86. The Theban triad Amun, Mut, and Khonsu. The Theban triad, the divine family of Amun, the great creator god and king of the gods. Mut, his consort, the divine mother whose name simply means mother in the ancient Egyptian language, and whose particular association with the vulture, the most devoted mother in the Egyptian natural world, expressed the quality of divine maternal protection that she embodied. And Khonsu, their son, the moon god whose name means traveler, reflecting the moon's nightly journey across the sky, was the theological foundation of the New Kingdom Egyptian state, the divine family whose earthly counterpart was the royal family of the pharaoh and whose temple complex at Karnak was the wealthiest and the most politically powerful religious institution in the history of the ancient world. Amun, whose name means the hidden one, a designation whose theological implication was that the ultimate creative principle transcended all visible manifestation, could not be reduced to any single natural phenomenon, and was accessible to human understanding only through his various appearances as the sun, the wind, and the divine force animating all living things, was the most theologically sophisticated of the major Egyptian deities. His synthesis with the sun god, Ra as Amun-Ra, creating a divine figure of universal scope, whose particular combination of cosmic power and personal accessibility made him the most widely worshipped god in Egypt during the New Kingdom period, and the deity most invoked in the personal piety texts of ordinary Egyptians seeking divine assistance with the problems of daily life. The wealth of the Amun temple at Karnak at the height of its New Kingdom prosperity, its estates comprising hundreds of thousands of hectares of agricultural land, its herds numbering hundreds of thousands of cattle, its workshops employing thousands of craftsmen, its granaries storing the surplus of its estates, and its treasury containing the accumulated tribute of centuries of royal patronage, made it the largest landowner in Egypt after the pharaoh himself. Its economic power, the material foundation of the political authority of the high priests of Amun, whose rivalry with the royal house in the later New Kingdom and the Third Intermediate Period was the primary internal political conflict of the civilization's final centuries of independence. Fact 87. Egyptian children's games, play in the ancient world. The play life of children in ancient Egypt, documented in the tomb paintings that show children engaged in competitive games, in the archaeological discovery of toys and game implements in the settlement sites and cemeteries of the Nile Valley, in the literary texts that describe the physical activities of the young, and in the skeletal evidence that reveals the patterns of growth and physical stress that the daily activities of Egyptian childhood imposed on the developing body. Reveals a world of childhood whose particular combination of physical freedom, communal play, and gradual initiation into the adult responsibilities of agricultural and artisanal life is both recognizably similar to and interestingly different from the childhood experience of subsequent civilizations. The toys found in Egyptian archaeological contexts, wooden horses with wheeled bases, clay rattles shaped like animals, leather balls, spinning tops, dolls with articulated limbs made from wood, cloth, and clay, whose painted hair and whose carefully crafted clothing suggest that they were objects of considerable affection rather than simply manufactured goods, demonstrate the universality across cultures and millennia of the human child's attraction to miniaturized representations of the animals, people, and objects of the adult world, and the particular Egyptian toy repertoire reveals, in its specific content, the specific world that Egyptian children inhabited. The wooden cattle that reflected the agricultural economy, the model boats that reflected the centrality of the Nile, and the tiny food vessels that reflected the domestic world of the Egyptian household. The physical games depicted in the tomb paintings of the New Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, The girls' games involving the rhythmic throwing and catching of balls, while performing simultaneous movements, played in groups of 2 or more with a coordination and a rhythm whose depiction in the tomb paintings suggests a level of organized play activity considerably more developed than simple spontaneous physical activity. The boys' competitive wrestling, stick fighting and running games whose overlap with the adult military and sporting traditions was presumably deliberate. The play of children preparing the body and the competitive disposition for the adult activities that Egyptian society required reveal a culture in which the physical education of children was understood as a natural function of the play activities that the children themselves chose. Without the requirement for the formal athletic curriculum that the Greek tradition, by contrast, considered indispensable to the proper formation of the male citizen. Fact 88: Egyptian astronomy and the stars of the dead. The stellar dimension of Egyptian religious thought, the particular body of astronomical observation, cosmological speculation, and theological symbolism through which the Egyptians understood the relationship between the visible heavens, the invisible divine realm, and the fate of the dead souls whose transformation into the transfigured Ak was understood to involve their incorporation into the stellar order, is among the most distinctive and the most intellectually interesting aspects of the Egyptian religious tradition. Its particular combination of practical astronomical observation, architectural orientation, and theological poetry, producing a view of the cosmos in which the night sky was simultaneously a scientific object of sustained study and a theological text whose reading required the same kind of expertise that the interpretation of the written religious texts demanded. The circumpolar stars, the stars visible throughout the year from the latitude of Egypt, which never set below the horizon and whose perpetual visibility made them, in the Egyptian understanding, the imperishable ones, the stars that never die, were the primary destination of the dead pharaoh in the oldest layer of the pyramid text tradition, their immortality the model for the immortality that the funerary program sought to achieve for the deceased king, and in later periods. For every Egyptian who underwent the proper funerary preparation, the specific orientation of the Great Pyramid's internal passages, the so-called air shafts of the king's chamber pointing toward the circumpolar star Thuban, the pole star of the Old Kingdom period, and toward the belt of Orion, the constellation identified with Osiris, whose heliacal rising marked the beginning of the Egyptian astronomical year, has been interpreted by the Egyptologist Robert Bovell as deliberate stellar alignments, whose purpose was to direct the soul of the dead pharaoh toward the specific stars with which his transformation was associated. A hypothesis whose particular details remain debated but whose general principle, that the orientation of the Egyptian funerary architecture was astronomically intentional, is supported by the broader pattern of temple and tomb alignments across the entire span of Egyptian civilization. The Egyptians looked at the night sky and saw not empty space punctuated by points of light, but a populated landscape, the dwelling place of the gods and the destination of the transfigured dead, a theological geography whose mapping was one of the primary intellectual enterprises of the civilization. Fact 89: The Egyptian oasis, life in the desert. The oases of the Egyptian Western Desert, the isolated depressions in the Saharan plateau, where the underground water table reaches close enough to the surface to sustain agriculture, vegetation, and permanent human settlement in the midst of one of the most inhospitable landscapes on Earth, played a role in the Egyptian administrative, agricultural, and religious history that their geographic marginality might seem to render unlikely, their particular combination of productive agricultural land, strategic location on the desert caravan routes, and religious significance as destinations of sacred pilgrimage, making them simultaneously economic assets, military outposts, and theological landmarks in the Egyptian understanding of the relationship between the ordered Nile Valley and the chaotic desert that surrounded it. The major oases of the Egyptian Western Desert, Karga, Dakhla, Farafra, Baharia, and the most remote and the most famous, Siwa, the oasis of the Oracle of Ammon, whose declaration that Alexander the Great was the son of God changed the course of ancient history, were settled from at least the Old Kingdom period, their populations maintained through the management of the artesian water sources whose natural pressure brought water to the surface without the need for lifting devices, and their agricultural production, dates, grain, olive oil, and wine of particular quality, supplementing the resources of the Nile Valley economy. The administrative history of the oases reveals their persistent strategic importance. The Karga Oasis, whose Persian period Temple of Hibis is the best preserved ancient temple in Egypt outside the Nile Valley, served as both a religious center and a place of exile. The Roman emperors used it as a destination for political and religious dissidents, whose removal from the populated world of the Nile Valley and the Mediterranean coast was considered more convenient than their execution. and its underground water management system of qanats. The gently sloping tunnels that collected the artesian water and directed it to the agricultural fields is one of the most impressive feats of ancient hydraulic engineering in the entire Egyptian tradition. The Siwa oasis, separated from the Nile Valley by 600 kilometers of desert, maintained through the entire span of ancient Egyptian and subsequent history its particular character as a place apart, a community whose isolation created a distinctive cultural identity and whose oracle, the most famous in the ancient world after Delphi, drew visitors from across the Mediterranean to ask the god Ammon the questions that the ordinary world could not answer. Fact 90. Ancient Egypt at 90. 90 facts into the history of ancient Egypt, and the civilization has revealed itself in the full range of its extraordinary achievement. The mathematical chemistry of the faience workshop and the theological poetry of the creation myths, the stern practicality of the tax records, and the tender intimacy of the children's toys, the naval strategy of the Medinet Habu reliefs, and the stellar theology of the pyramid shafts pointing toward stars that the dead pharaoh would join in their eternal circuit. We have sat with the coffin texts and understood the particular quality of the Middle Kingdom's theological generosity, the decision to extend to every Egyptian of sufficient means the magical resources that the Old Kingdom had reserved for the pharaoh alone, a decision whose implications for the subsequent development of Egyptian religious thought were as profound as any doctrinal reform in the history of religion. We have followed the Opit procession down the avenue of sphinxes from Karnak to Luxor, heard the harps and the sistrums, smelled the incense and the roasted meat, and understood that the Egyptian festival was simultaneously a theological act, a political demonstration, and a feast at which the people of Thebes ate well because the gods were generous. We have held the wooden toy horse of an Egyptian child in the mind's eye and felt the particular quality of an emotion that crosses every boundary of time and culture. The parent watching the child play, the child absorbed in the miniature world of the toy, the small moment of happiness that the 3,000-year gap between that child's world and ours does nothing to diminish. We have followed the Oasis caravan across the western desert to Siwa and stood in the sanctuary where the god told Alexander what he needed to hear, and understood that the oracle's power was not in the god's answer, but in the questioner's willingness to walk 500 kilometers through the desert to ask. 10 facts remain. The story moves now toward its conclusion, not its end, because ancient Egypt has no end, only a continuation in different forms in every civilization that has touched its legacy. Rest now in the deep quiet of the ancient dark. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 91. The Egyptian palette before the pyramids. The ceremonial palettes of pre-dynastic and early dynastic Egypt, the carved stone slabs whose practical origin was the grinding of the mineral pigments used for eye paint, and whose evolution into large, elaborately decorated ceremonial objects covered with carved relief scenes of royal and divine activity, represents the earliest surviving tradition of Egyptian narrative art, are the most direct surviving evidence of the intellectual and aesthetic world from which the great civilization of the pharaohs emerged, their particular combination of symbolic imagery, hierarchical composition, and royal ideology encoding in material form the values and the visual language that would define Egyptian art for the next 3,000 years. The Nama palette, discovered at Hierakonpolis in 1898, and now the most important single object in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, carved from a single piece of grey siltstone approximately 64 centimeters in height, its two sides covered with relief carvings depicting the pharaoh Nama in the act of smiting his enemies, inspecting the decapitated bodies of the defeated, and processing in triumph as the king of a united Egypt, is simultaneously the oldest historical document in Egyptian history, the founding monument of the Egyptian artistic tradition, and the earliest surviving expression of the royal ideology whose essential elements, the pharaoh as the dominant figure in any composition, his enemies prostrate at his feet, the gods represented by their emblematic animals processing before him, the entire visual field organized around the absolute hierarchy of the divine king, would remain the governing conventions of Egyptian monumental art without fundamental change from the moment of their first appearance on this palette to the last temple relief carved under Roman imperial patronage 3,000 years later. The earlier pre-dynastic palettes, the battlefield palette with its lions and vultures devouring the defeated, the two-dog palette with its heraldic animals, the hunter's palette with its ordered procession of hunters converging on their prey, preserve in their developing visual sophistication the emergence of the representational conventions and the hierarchical spatial organization that the Nama palette would crystallize into the fixed vocabulary of the mature Egyptian tradition, allowing scholars to trace, in these few objects of grey stone, the formation of the specific visual intelligence that would eventually build the Great Pyramid and paint the tomb of Nefertari. Fact 92. Egyptian quarrying, the mountains that built the monuments. The quarrying industry of ancient Egypt, whose products, the limestone, sandstone, granite, quartzite, basalt, alabaster, and diorite, extracted from the geological formations of the Nile Valley and its surrounding desert, provided the raw material for the most extensive and the most durable building program in the history of the ancient world, was one of the most logistically demanding enterprises of the Egyptian state. Requiring the organization of thousands of workers in remote and hostile desert environments, the development of cutting techniques appropriate to some of the hardest stones known to the ancient world, and the transport of blocks whose individual weights could reach hundreds of tons from the quarry face to the construction site hundreds of kilometers away. The limestone that forms the bulk of the Great Pyramid was quarried primarily from the Tura Formation on the east bank of the Nile opposite Giza, whose fine white limestone provided both the casing stones, whose polished surface originally gave the pyramid its brilliant appearance, and the interior chamber linings, whose quality is still visible in the king's chamber today. The transport of the quarried blocks across the Nile and up the plateau to the construction site being accomplished by a combination of river barging during the annual inundation, whose raised water level brought the transport vessels closer to the pyramid base than the normal river level permitted, and the sledge haulage across moistened wooden tracks, whose friction reduction was managed by the teams of workers depicted in the tomb painting of Jehu-Tihotep hauling a colossal statue on a sledge. A single man pouring water in front of the runners, while hundreds of workers pull on ropes. The red granite of the Aswan quarries, used for the sarcophagi, the obelisks, the temple columns, and the colossal statues of the New Kingdom period, whose particular combination of hardness, color, and the ability to take a high polish made it the most prestigious of the Egyptian building stones, was cut from the living rock using the technique of driving wooden wedges soaked in water into slots cut along the desired break line. The expansion of the swelling wood exerting sufficient force to split the granite along the grain in blocks, whose dimensions were predetermined by the quarry master's knowledge of the stone's internal structure. The unfinished obelisk still lying in its quarry cut at Aswan, a crack having appeared in the granite during the cutting process, preserves for the modern visitor the most direct evidence of the quarrying technique, whose mastery made the Egyptian monumental tradition possible. Its recumbent form, 42 meters long, 1,200 tons, a monument to the ambition of a civilization that attempted and very nearly succeeded in cutting a single shaft of stone larger than anything before or since. Fact 93. The Egyptian Delta, the land of 1,000 channels. The Nile Delta, the broad fan of alluvial land formed by the deposition of the river's sediment, at the point where the Nile divides into its multiple distributary channels before reaching the Mediterranean Sea, covering an area of approximately 22,000 square kilometers and constituting, in ancient times, the most densely populated and the most agriculturally productive region of Egypt, was a world as different from the narrow ribbon of the upper Egyptian Nile Valley as it is possible to imagine within the same civilization. Its flat, marshy, canal-threaded landscape of papyrus marshes, shallow lakes, and rich black soil producing a character of settlement, economy, and religious life that the towering cliffs and the desert margins of Upper Egypt could not accommodate. The delta's particular ecological character, its networks of shallow channels and marshes providing ideal habitat for the waterfowl, fish, and papyrus that were among the primary resources of the Egyptian economy, made it the setting for the scenes of hunting and fishing in the papyrus thickets that the Egyptian tomb paintings render with such vividness. The standing figure of the tomb owner, harpoon in hand, balanced on a papyrus raft in a dense stand of flowering reeds, his wife and children beside him, the water teeming with fish, the air thick with birds disturbed by the throw of the throwing stick. The religious landscape of the Delta was as different from that of Upper Egypt as its physical landscape. The cult centers of the Delta, Buto, the ancient capital of Lower Egypt, Sais, the city of the goddess Neith, Bubastes, the city of Bastet, Heliopolis, the city of Ra, and the great administrative capital of Memphis at the Delta's apex, were the oldest sacred sites in Egypt, their particular religious traditions preserving layers of theological development that predated the unification and whose influence on the royal theology of the unified state was as formative as anything that Upper Egypt contributed. The Delta's vulnerability to incursion from the northeast, the natural invasion route from the Sinai and the Levant through which the Hyksos had entered, through which the Persians and the Assyrians would follow, and through which Alexander would arrive, gave the eastern delta in particular a military importance, whose management by the successive pharaohs through fortress construction, canal digging, and the settlement of loyal military communities was among the primary preoccupations of Egyptian strategic planning from the Middle Kingdom onward. Fact 94. Egyptian cartouches, the name that protected the king. The cartouche, the oval loop of rope depicted in Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions surrounding the personal names of the pharaoh. Its form derived from the hieroglyphic sign for eternity and its function the magical protection of the royal name through whose enclosure the name, and by extension the person it identified, was rendered safe from the hostile powers that the pronunciation or the writing of a name without its protective enclosure might attract. Is the most immediately recognizable feature of Egyptian royal inscriptions to the modern eye, the oval frames whose contents, once their nature as royal name containers was understood by Champollion in his decipherment of the Rosetta Stone, provided the key that unlocked the entire hieroglyphic writing system. The Egyptian understanding of the personal name was profoundly different from the modern Western conception of the name as a convenient social label whose relationship to the person it designates is purely conventional. In the Egyptian world, the name was a component of the person in the same sense that the car and the bar were components, a part of the individual's total identity, whose destruction would damage the person it named, and whose preservation was therefore as important as the preservation of the physical body. The deliberate erasure of a person's name from the monuments, the damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, applied to Akhenaten, to Hatshepsut, to the disgraced officials and the defeated enemies whose images and whose names were chiseled from the walls of the temples and the tombs, was understood not merely as a political act of historical revision, but as a magical act of personal destruction, the removal of the name from the visible world, severing the connection between the name, the person, and the afterlife that the name was intended to sustain. The cartouche's protective function was extended, in the popular religious tradition, to the wearing of miniature cartouche amulets bearing the name of the ruling pharaoh, whose divine power, concentrated in the royal name, was understood to extend protection to the bearer of the amulet in the same way that a modern person might carry a photograph of someone beloved as a form of connection to their protective presence. A use of the written name as magical talisman that reflects the most intimate intersection of the Egyptian literary and the Egyptian religious traditions. Fact 95. The Egyptian Empire, Bronze Age superpower. The Egyptian Empire of the New Kingdom period, the territorial and political entity that the military campaigns of the 18th and 19th dynasty pharaohs created, maintained, and ultimately failed to sustain across the approximately 5 centuries between the expulsion of the Hyksos under Ahmose I in approximately 1550 BCE and the progressive contraction of Egyptian imperial power in the Levant that followed the death of Ramesses III in approximately 1155 BCE, was the most extensive political structure in the ancient world during the period of its maximum expansion under Thutmose III, whose empire stretched from the Fourth Nile Cataract in the south to the Euphrates River in the north, encompassing the gold fields of Nubia, the cedar forests of Lebanon, the grain lands of Canaan, and the copper mines of the Sinai in a single administrative structure whose extraction of tribute and the management of diplomatic relationships with the competing great powers of the Mitanni, Hittite, Babylonian, and Assyrian kingdoms constituted the primary foreign policy challenge of the Egyptian state for the entire New Kingdom period. The mechanisms through which the empire was governed reveal the Egyptian preference for indirect administration over direct military occupation. The Levantine city-states were not absorbed into the Egyptian administrative system, but maintained as vassal states under their existing rulers, whose loyalty was secured through the combination of Egyptian military garrisons at strategic points, the requirement to send their sons to the Egyptian court for education in the Egyptian cultural and administrative tradition, the extraction of annual tribute in the form of the particular luxury goods, silver, bronze, timber, horses, and craftsmen, that each region produced, and the implicit threat of punitive military expedition against those who defaulted on their obligations or transferred their allegiance to a rival power. The Egyptian presence in Nubia was considerably more direct. The construction of temples, the appointment of Egyptian officials, and the active Egyptianization of the local elite, reflecting the greater strategic and economic importance of the Nubian goldfields to the Egyptian state and the Egyptian assessment that the Nubian population, unlike the politically sophisticated city-states of the Levant, could be effectively incorporated into the Egyptian cultural and administrative system, rather than merely supervised from a distance. Fact 96. The Egyptian flood myth, chaos and the annual return. The Egyptian relationship with the annual Nile flood, whose particular combination of absolute dependability over the long term and year-to-year variation in height that could mean the difference between abundance and famine gave it a theological character, unlike that of any other natural phenomenon in the Egyptian world. Was expressed not in a single narrative myth comparable to the Mesopotamian flood story preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but in a diffuse body of mythological and cosmological imagery, whose common thread was the equation between the primordial waters of chaos, from which the created world had emerged at the moment of creation, and the annual waters of the Nile, whose recession revealed, each year, a fresh layer of the fertile black soil whose appearance replicated. On the scale of a single river valley, the emergence of the first land from the first waters at the beginning of time. The theological resonance of this equation was profound. Each inundation was not merely a natural event, but a cosmological one, a temporary return of the primordial chaos that preceded creation, whose recession each year renewed the world in the most literal possible sense, depositing the soil from which the year's food would grow, resetting the agricultural calendar, and confirming that the divine order maintained by the pharaoh's ritual performance was still in effect. That the gods had not abandoned the world to the disorder, that the flood's temporary obliteration of the landscape's familiar features seemed to threaten. The fear of a flood that was too high, washing away the villages on their low mounds, destroying the irrigation infrastructure, depositing soil too saturated with water to be worked before the planting season, or too low, leaving much of the cultivable land too dry for agriculture, producing the famine conditions that the records of the First Intermediate Period and other times of political weakness describe with harrowing specificity. Was the constant background anxiety of Egyptian agricultural life, its management through the Nilometer records, and the administrative adjustment of the tax assessment, the most practically important function of the Egyptian bureaucratic system. The Egyptians did not fear the flood as a catastrophe, but lived with it as a condition. Its annual coming the most reliable sign that the universe was operating as it should, its occasional excess or deficiency the first indication that something in the cosmic order required the pharaoh's attention. Fact 97, Egyptology, the science that recovered a world. Egyptology, the academic discipline devoted to the systematic study of ancient Egyptian civilization through the analysis of its material remains, its written records, its artistic production, and its physical environment, using the methods of archaeology, philology, art history, physical anthropology, archaeobotany, and an increasing range of scientific analytical techniques. Was born in the specific historical moment of Napoleon's Egyptian campaign of 1798, and has developed, across the 2 centuries, since Champollion's decipherment of the hieroglyphic script in 1822, into one of the most richly documented fields in the study of the ancient world, its particular combination of the extraordinary preservation conditions of the Egyptian desert, the vast scale of the surviving monument and text record, and the sustained international investment in excavation and research that has characterized the field since the mid-19th century, producing a body of knowledge whose depth and whose detail are without parallel for any other ancient civilization of comparable antiquity. The history of Egyptology is inseparable from the history of the European engagement with Egypt. Its early decades dominated by the combination of antiquarian enthusiasm and institutional spoliation that produced the great European museum collections of Egyptian antiquities, whose acquisition, in an era before international conventions for the protection of cultural heritage, by methods ranging from purchase through barter to outright removal, has generated the repatriation debates that continue to occupy the relationship between the Egyptian state and the European and North American museums that hold the primary collections. The development of scientific Egyptology in the 20th century, the systematic application of stratigraphic excavation methods, radiocarbon dating, DNA analysis, medical imaging of mummies, satellite survey of buried sites, and the digital imaging and analysis of fragile texts, has transformed the quality and the precision of the knowledge available about ancient Egypt beyond anything that the founding generation of Egyptologists could have imagined, answering questions that the text record alone could never resolve, while simultaneously generating new questions whose pursuit is the ongoing work of the discipline. Every excavation season in Egypt adds to the record. New tombs, new texts, new objects, new individuals whose names had never been known, emerging from the sand that has kept them for 3,000 or 4,000 years, and offering each time the particular quality of encounter that makes Egyptology one of the most compelling of the humanities, the sudden presence in the desert stillness of a specific human life. Fact 98, the Egyptian legacy in language, words from the Nile. The linguistic legacy of ancient Egypt in the modern world, the words, concepts, and naming traditions that passed from the civilization of the Nile Valley into the Greek, Latin, Coptic, Arabic, and European languages, whose descendants constitute the primary literary languages of the contemporary world, is considerably more pervasive than the non-specialist might expect, its particular traces visible in vocabulary as diverse as the names of the months. The technical terminology of chemistry, the words for common objects, and the proper names that the Egyptian religious tradition contributed to the Christian and Islamic traditions through the mediation of the biblical and Quranic texts. The word chemistry itself, and its derivative alchemy, derives through the Arabic alchemia from the Greek chemia, which most scholars trace to the Egyptian word Kemet, the Black Land, the name by which the Egyptians designated their own country, and by extension the particular expertise in the manipulation of materials that the Egyptian tradition of metallurgy, glass-making, and faience production had developed. The black earth of the Nile Valley gave its name to the science of material transformation in a linguistic lineage that runs from the Old Kingdom workshops of the Delta to the modern chemistry laboratory. The names of the Egyptian months, whose Coptic forms, preserved in the liturgical calendar of the Egyptian Christian Church, passed into the agricultural calendar of modern Egypt, and whose echoes are audible in the month names of the Coptic calendar still in use, represent the most direct linguistic survival of the ancient Egyptian temporal system in the living language of the Egyptian people. The proper names that the Egyptian religious tradition contributed to the biblical and subsequently the Christian tradition: Moses, whose name the Hebrew tradition itself associates with the Egyptian word for water or child; Phineas, Hophni, and Potipharah, the Egyptian names that appear in the Hebrew Bible's narratives of the Egyptian period, are the most intimate linguistic traces of the contact between the civilization of the Nile and the civilization of ancient Israel, whose literary output shaped the subsequent religious history of half the world. Fact 99. What ancient Egypt gave the world. We stand now at the 99th fact, one step from the end of the longest journey, the one that began at the banks of a river and has traveled through 3,000 years of the most astonishing human achievement the ancient world produced. And it is time for the particular kind of reckoning that 99 facts of accumulated knowledge makes possible and demands. What did ancient Egypt give the world? The answer is not a list but a disposition. The conviction, acted out in stone and paint and gold, and written on papyrus in the ink of the most beautiful script ever devised, that the universe is a moral order whose maintenance is the primary obligation of every conscious being, that the natural world is not a neutral backdrop to human activity, but a sacred text whose careful reading reveals the divine intelligence that sustains it. That beauty is not an ornament of civilization, but its most direct expression of the values that make civilization worth having, and that the proper response to the knowledge of mortality is not despair, but the most intense possible investment in the life that mortality bounds. The pyramids are the most visible expression of this disposition, structures of such scale and such precision that the modern world still cannot fully explain them, built not for military defense or commercial advantage, but for the single purpose of ensuring that a specific human being, whose divine nature the Egyptian tradition affirmed with complete seriousness, made the transition from the mortal to the immortal state with all the provisions and all the protection that human ingenuity and human labor could supply. The love poems of the New Kingdom scribes are its most intimate expression, young men and women writing to one another in a voice of such specific tenderness, such physical joy, such precise observation of the particular quality of the beloved's presence, that the 3,000-year gap between their world and ours collapses entirely and leaves only the feeling, which is unchanged. And the Book of the Dead, with its scale and its feather, its 42 assessors and its waiting monster, its demand that the heart be lighter than the truth, is its most morally serious expression. The insistence that how a person lives is the most important fact about them, more important than their birth, their wealth, their power, and their beauty, and that the universe, in its patient and impartial way, will eventually weigh them and find out. Fact 100. The eternal Nile, what Egypt still is. And so we arrive at the 100th fact, at the end of a journey that began in the dark, with the sound of the river and the smell of the black soil, and that has traveled through 5,000 years of the most extraordinary civilization the ancient world produced, to arrive here, in this quiet moment, with the river still flowing. The Nile is still there. It flows today as it has flowed for 5 million years, northward through the Sahara, giving life to the narrow strip of ground on either side, reaching the delta and spreading into its channels and entering the sea. The pyramids are still there, standing on the western plateau above the river as they have stood for 4,500 years, their original casing stones long gone, but their core masonry as solid as the day it was laid by the 20,000 workers, whose breakfast rations are still legible in the papyrus records of their foremen. The hieroglyphs are still there, On every temple wall, every tomb corridor, every obelisk that the centuries have left standing in Egypt and carried to Paris, Rome, New York, and Istanbul, waiting to be read by anyone who has learned the language, speaking across 4,000 years in the voice of a civilization that refused, with every tool at its disposal, to be silenced by death. What ancient Egypt is in the end is an argument, the longest and the most elaborately made argument in the history of human civilization, for the proposition that death does not have the final word. The argument was made in stone because stone endures. It was made in gold because gold does not corrode. It was made in the precise astronomical alignments of the pyramid shafts because the stars do not go out. It was made in the love poems because love, like the stars, persists beyond the body that housed it. And it was made, most fundamentally, in the daily performance of the ritual that maintained the cosmic order. The priest in the darkness of the sanctuary, the farmer in the flooded field, the scribe at the pallet, the embalmer at the 70-day work, each of them doing their specific part in the maintenance of Ma'at, the right relationship between all things, whose continuity was the condition of the universe's continued existence and whose daily renewal was the most serious work in the world. The ancient Egyptians believed that the soul does not end when the body does. They organized an entire civilization around that belief. They built the largest structures in human history in its service. They developed the most sophisticated funerary technology the ancient world possessed to support it. And they asked, in every tomb inscription and every spell in every book of the dead, the same question that every conscious being has asked since consciousness first became aware of its own impermanence: what comes after? We do not know the answer. The Egyptians did not know either, not with certainty, not with the knowledge that eliminates the question. What they knew was the question's weight, and they carried it with a seriousness and a grace that the 3,000-year record of their civilization still radiates. Close your eyes, let the river carry you. The black soil is under your feet. The stars are above you, and somewhere in the dark, the priest is smoothing away his footprints as he withdraws from the sanctuary, leaving the god alone in the silence that preceded the world and that will outlast it. You have traveled the length of the longest river. You have stood in the presence of the oldest monuments. You have held in the quiet of this night the full weight of what it means to be a civilization that looked at death and said, "Not yet. Carry what you have heard gently into your sleep. The Nile is still flowing." This is explored during sleeping,